All right, we're up on YouTube.
Good morning. Welcome to the September meeting of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill Board of Trustees meeting. For those of you watching remotely on Zoom or otherwise remotely, thank you for joining us. For those of you here in the Carolina Inn, we're glad to be back in our usual space, although distance and mostly masking. I'll put mine back on when I'm not talking. We are in a large ballroom. I think the Chancellor is about 8 or 9 feet from me and the Vice Chair is about the same. So we're scattered over a large ballroom, as you'll see in the video for social distancing purposes. First couple logistics. For those of you here in the room, when you speak, please turn on your microphone. The little light will become red when it's on. Leave it on while you're speaking. You don't have to hold it the whole time. Just leave it on while you're speaking, and please turn it off when you've finished. For those on Zoom who will be speaking or not, please mute your microphone until you do start speaking. And also, when you do speak or make a motion or second a motion, please identify yourself for the record. Under recently enacted amendments to the North Carolina General Statutes concerning virtual meetings by public bodies, and some of our members are remote today, so this is a remote meeting, all votes will be by roll call. Additionally, just for the members and others, all chats, instant messages, text, or other written communications between members of the board regarding the transaction of the public business during the remote meeting are deemed to be a public record. We now recognize Secretary Teresa Artis Neal to call the roll.
Ms. Artis Neal, present. Mr. Bolick.
Present.
Mr. Brown.
Here.
Mr. Kobe.
Present.
Mr. Cochran.
Here.
Mr. Davis.
Present.
Mr. Duckett.
Here.
Mrs. Hopkins. Here. Mr. McCullen.
Present.
Mr. Meekins.
Present.
Mr. Mosley. Mr. Pryor.
Present.
Mr. Stevens.
Present.
Mr. Chairman, we have a quorum.
Thank you, ma'am. You have the agenda and it's been published as well. Let me just point out to all watching and the members, item 3 under the Finance, Infrastructure, and Audit Committee will not be considered at this meeting. Now I need to read the ethics statement. As Chair of the Board of Trustees, it's my responsibility to remind all members of the board of their duty under the State Government Ethics Act to avoid conflicts of interest and appearances of conflicts of interest as required by this act. Each member has received the agenda and related information for the Board of Trustees meeting. If any board member knows of any conflict of interest or appearance of conflict of interest with respect to any matter coming before the Board of Trustees at this meeting, the conflict or the appearance of conflict should be identified at this time. I'd like to point out that I do have a conflict or a potential conflict of interest on item 2 under the Finance, Infrastructure, and Audit Committee. I'll not be discussing, voting, or participating in that item.
Mr. Chairman.
Trustee Brown.
I have a similar conflict on item 2.
Item 2, Trustee Brown also will be abstaining and not participating. I want to welcome our liaison with us today, Governor David Powers from the Board of Governors. We're glad you're able to participate with us remotely. I know you're covering a couple of meetings today, including ours, and we thank you for all you do for the university system and your role here as our liaison. I'd like to call on Governor Powers if he has any comments for us.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I hate I can't be there with you. I do have both you guys and UNC Pembroke this week, and I had UNC Healthcare earlier in the week. So I've got a kind of a busy university schedule this week. But glad to be with you as always. Not a whole lot to report. We just had a meeting a couple of weeks ago, or last week actually. So it was actually one of the quieter, smoother meetings we've had in a while. We did have a little bit of controversy about changes to the Chancellor selection process, but have talked about this extensively with President Hans, and he really is desirous to build more strength within our bench, so to speak, and to to really delve into talent development throughout the system in leadership roles. So I think hopefully that'll help us do some of that. And we've been in a situation like you guys in Chapel Hill, where more of our universities will be able to find their chancellors from within as opposed to without, because I think we've got a ton of great leaders throughout the system. So other than that, I'm just here to listen. Any questions I can answer for you guys, I'm happy to do. Just let me know.
Thank you, Governor Powers, for joining us. You're very diligent in doing that, and we appreciate your liaison work and your work on the Board of Governors for us in the whole state.
Thank you.
You hopefully read the materials listed under the consent agenda. Is there any item that needs to be removed from the discussion portion of either the open or closed session agenda? If not, I'll entertain a motion.
So move.
For the folks on the Zoom call, stand by. It looks like we lost the feed from the end, so we're working on getting that resolved.
Meekins,
Yes.
Mr. Mosley,
Yes.
Mr. Pryor,
Yes.
and Mr. Stevens.
Yes.
Do we think?
Let's wait a minute to see if we can get trustees Cochran and McCullen back online.
I'm back.
Okay.
Mr. Cochran?
Yes.
Okay, but that's good enough.
I'm back online.
Mr. McCullen, do you approve the motion?
Yes.
Motion passes. And also, when you, again, if you would, when you're making a motion, please identify yourself. This is a huge room and I'm having trouble figuring out voices. So help me out on that if you would. I want to start the meeting with a heartfelt thank you to every member of our university community for all their hard work during this difficult time. COVID-19 has threatened and challenged our university at every turn. We're grateful for the ways that our students and staff and faculty and administration have responded. Since our last meeting in July, the university resumed on-campus operations, but due to the rapid spread of the virus, was forced to end in-person classes for undergraduates. As a board, we understand the stress these events have caused our faculty and students and staff. We acknowledge the financial stress for many students who don't have their own campus jobs. We're concerned about the reports of increased mental health issues for our students as reported at the Board of Governors meeting last week. We're aware of the many challenges that our community is facing and the sacrifices that are being made to further our mission of teaching, research, and public service. Thank you from all of us on the board. We do mean that most sincerely. Also want to thank you to the Chancellor and his leadership team for their efforts to lead during this difficult time. Decisions they're making are not easy. We appreciate your work as you listen to students, faculty, staff, alumni, community members, board members, and others. We know your team has worked to ensure that our students could have the best possible experience. We join you in our disappointment that an on-campus experience was not possible for most students this fall. As a board, we look forward to the discussion today of what we've learned so far this fall and the steps you plan, Chancellor, to take moving forward to make decisions for the spring semester. We also look forward to hearing from Vice Chancellors Nate Knuffman and Becky Mangini on the impact these decisions have had and will have on our budget and personnel. Last week, you received a message announcing plans to celebrate the installation of Kevin Guskowich as our 12th Chancellor. With the condensed fall semester schedule, it was decided to not pause classes for University Day as is typically done. And the installation will be at 3 o'clock on Sunday, October 11th, instead of October 12th. The event will be available to the entire community virtually, and we look forward to celebrating with Kevin and his family. This week, we received the news that Steve Farmer will depart at the end of this semester to take on a new role as Vice Provost for Enrollment at the University of Virginia. Steve has been an invaluable member of our community for over 20 years, expanding accessibility and affordability for our students. Carolina would not be the university it is today without his hard work. We will miss you, Steve, and thank you for all you've done here. I want to end with a word of thanks to all the staff who helped make this meeting possible. With both in-person and remote components, this meeting was not the easiest to coordinate, and we appreciate their hard efforts. Now I want to welcome Reeves Mosley, our student body president. Turn it over to him for remarks. Reeves.
Thank you, Chair Stevens. Hello, everyone. I hope you are doing well, and I'm so happy to see many of your faces, even if they're covered with masks. Thank you for allowing me this opportunity to update you on what the undergraduate and graduate student governments are currently working on and will continue to work on as we move through this academic year. Though this continues to be a semester that has challenged us like never before, I'm proud of the work being done to improve comfort, inclusion, and success across the Carolina community. Thank you to everyone involved in the process working to ensure the safety, well-being, and educational advancement of the student body and Carolina community as a whole. That being said, it is crucial to recognize that students are very tired. The general feelings across both the undergraduate and graduate populations find that the experience they are receiving this fall is nothing similar to that of what it usually is. As a community, the entire community is struggling, and it is imperative to go about the spring semester in a way that includes the concerns, thoughts, and perspectives of the wide expanse of people impacted. In other news, it is an incredible honor to co-chair the Campus and Community Advisory Committee, which held its first meeting this week. Besides myself, there are 5 other student representatives that provide necessary input from a variety of perspectives. These members include Ryan Collins, GPSF President, Mayan Adams, GPSF Chief of External Relations and Advocacy, Kira Griffith, RHA President, Lamar Richards, Chair of the Commission on Campus Equality and Student Equity, and Ethan Phillips, Student Advisory Committee to the Chancellor member. I would like to thank Chancellor Gusowitz for the opportunity to represent students' perspectives in this capacity. Additionally, the Association of Student Governments will convene virtually this weekend to discuss collaborative efforts for the groups moving forward and how to navigate this upcoming spring semester. Undergraduate student government has continued to work on multiple projects that will improve student life on campus while simultaneously increasing student involvement and engagement across a variety of platforms. In the meantime, USG has been working hard on a number of projects surrounding the times and current issues impacting students. First, the Minority and Low-Income Professional Development Program will offer minority undergraduate students free exam preparation for graduate and professional entrance exams, in addition to providing current UNC graduate and professional students free study supplies and fee assistance for exam costs. Additionally, we are planning the 2020 Roundtable on COVID-19, higher ed, and racial equity to take place in October 2020 and will assist in guiding recommendations for the spring 2021 semester. The GPSF has launched a civil engagement campaign for the fall semester focused on encouraging voter turnout in the 2020 election and participation in the census. This has included a series of periodic emails with important dates, reminders, FAQs, as well as a social media campaign. Their president, Ryan Collins, will speak more on the actions taken by GPSF during his remarks. I'm encouraged by the process we have made this far, and I look forward to continuing to work with you all moving forward as we work hard to ensure the best experience for the entirety of the Carolina community. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Chair Stevens. And it's great to see everybody in person and a few of you on Zoom. I appreciate your guidance, support as I've enjoyed my conversations with several of you over the past few weeks as we work through this challenging time. I also want to echo Richard's thanks to Steve Farmer. Steve, as you know, has been a critical part of our campus community for 20 years at Carolina. His hard work has helped us to expand accessibility and affordability for our students, something for which we're very proud of. It's one of the things that keeps us high in our rankings that we're so proud of. But I think more importantly, it keeps us true to our mission at Carolina of being the university of the people, fostering the success and prosperity of each rising generation. Had the opportunity, as did Trustee Artis Neal this past Monday, to speak alongside Steve at a Black alumni event. And every time I present alongside Steve, I'm impressed by his wisdom and dedication to our students. We look forward to celebrating Steve's many accomplishments later this semester. While we conduct a search for Steve's permanent replacement, Rachel Feldman will be serving as interim provost for enrollment and undergraduate admissions. And I want to thank Rachel for her willingness to serve in this capacity. She's going to do an outstanding job. She came to us from Cal Berkeley about 4 years ago, and Rachel will do a great job for us. I want to start my comments off by this morning by also offering, as Chair Stevens did, a heartfelt thank you to our campus community for their hard work during this difficult time. This has certainly been a time of great uncertainty, but I would also add a time of opportunity. This is an opportunity for Carolina to reimagine itself. How can Carolina adapt and continue to lead in teaching, research, and service, and to have an even greater impact on the citizens of North Carolina? And I'm confident that we can do this. We are teaching right now more students than we've ever taught in the history of the university. Our credit hours are up 10% this semester. Our world-class faculty have answered the call and have found innovative and creative ways to deliver instruction to our students. Many of our graduate classes are still being taught in person here on campus. Our research labs, most of them remain open, some at reduced capacity, but I'm just proud of the way that the campus community has responded. Our researchers are on track for another record year. We're 13% ahead of last year's record-breaking year in terms of the amount of research dollars that are coming into the university right now. But as I always say, it's not just about the research dollars, it's about the impact that research has on society, and that's what's most important. But every day I am grateful to lead this incredible group of students, faculty, and staff who are dedicated to our mission. And I look forward to the University Day events and the installation on October 11th and 12th, and to really celebrating the many contributions that Carolina makes here in North Carolina and across the nation. So I want to talk about three items today, three brief updates. First, our planning for the spring semester. And second, I want to provide an update on the budget situation. Then finally, I want to share the many ways in which our students, faculty, and staff are continuing their critical work this semester to help, again, keep our mission, us staying true to our mission. So first, for the roadmap. You've heard our updates throughout the summer months. We prepared for this fall semester. Months of preparation and work with our infectious disease and public health experts, our faculty, staff, and students who spent many, many hours in this planning. And I'm certainly disappointed that we couldn't keep as many students on campus this fall semester as we had hoped. But I'm grateful to our staff and faculty for pivoting quickly to continue instruction for the fall. And as you've already heard, we're continuing to deliver an outstanding education to our students. We've now turned our planning and preparation for the spring 2021 semester, and we're currently scheduled for a January 6th start date. And as I've told some people, I've been here for 25 years, and I think this has to be the earliest start date on record that I can recall, January the 6th. And so we are working alongside a number of teams, including our infectious disease public health experts, the campus and community advisory committee that Reeves Mosley mentioned. And we are likely going to be moving that start date later in January. Provost Bluen and I were actually discussing this just last evening. Our registrar, Lauren DeGrazia, has mapped out 4 or 5 different options for us, but we'll most likely be moving that start date to either January 13th or January 19th. And we'll announce this within the next 2 weeks after we consult with a number of our campus constituencies. That Campus and Community Advisory Committee was launched just this week, and I again want to thank Shayna Hill, Reeves Mosley, and Mimi Chapman for their willingness to co-chair this committee. And their work is going to be critical to our plans moving forward over the next 8 to 9 weeks. And as our leadership team and I make decisions about the spring semester. This Campus and Community Advisory group is comprised of a diverse group of faculty, staff, students, and community members. And I will count on this committee to reach out to their constituencies to ensure that we have as many voices at the table as possible that we can consider as we're making these decisions. Our hope is that we will bring students back to live and learn on campus this spring semester. We would scale this to provide an on-campus experience for as many students as we can safely accommodate, and that's what we'll be working toward alongside these various groups. As my leadership team and I make these decisions, we will be consulting with several groups and content experts, as well as you, our Board of Trustees, who I look forward to consulting with as we're working through these decisions. We'll also be working closely with the UNC system and President Hans. We will work to make these decisions as soon as possible, and I know that our community needs time to prepare, and so time is of the essence. As Richard's already mentioned, I've talked to many students, faculty, and staff who are struggling, and we're working hard as a community to support them. These students, faculty, staff are incredibly resilient, and we're all looking forward to having them back on campus when we can do so safely. Second, regarding the budget. Becky Mangini and Nate Knuffman are going to be speaking more about this later today. But as I mentioned over the summer, every revenue source at the university right now is threatened by the pandemic. And we've been monitoring this since late March, early April, and I believe we are putting the appropriate measures in place to mitigate the shortfall. And there will likely be more to come. But while ensuring the safety and well-being of our campus community, this is clearly a top priority. We have to also consider the financial health of the university. The good news, as I've already mentioned, is that enrollment is up, along with our research enterprise is continuing to bring in an incredible amount of money to help support that enterprise, but we'll have to make difficult decisions as we move forward. Third and finally, we remain focused on providing an excellent education for our students this fall. Last week, I had the opportunity to sit in on a data science class that's part of our Carolina Away program. This program, you heard me talk about it over the summer, has 700 students enrolled, mostly first-year students, transfer students, and our international students. They enrolled over the summer. This is an entirely remote program, allowing these students to receive 15 credit hours. There are 2 unique components that I think make this a special program, a uniquely Carolina program that I'd like to talk about. It includes learning communities and virtual events that student affairs have brought to these students remotely, and it creates a connection to each other and to the campus. It brings Carolina and the resources that we could offer in an in-person experience to these students virtually, so that they'll be better prepared when they arrive here on campus, hopefully this spring semester. I also had the opportunity this week. This was a big week. It was actually last week was a big week. I had an opportunity to have lunch, socially distanced, spread out over at the Loudermilk Center with 25 of our Robertson Scholars Leadership Program students, along with Bill Goodell, who's the director of the program. But we had a wonderful lunch where we talked about leadership. We had a special guest, Coach Mac Brown, came in and talked about leadership with the group, and we'll be doing this again in about a week and a half with a second group of 25 Robertson Scholar students. So we're trying to do everything we can to provide some on-campus interactions with students, socially distanced. Last week, we also celebrated the Asian American Center's virtual opening and its first programming, where we introduced newly appointed director, Professor Heidi Kim. As you know, our Asian American students represent the largest group of underrepresented students on our campus, and this was a long time in coming for this center to come to fruition, and we're excited about the opportunity for these students to launch that program. And the program for public discourse, which was approved last year, continues to thrive under the leadership of Professor Sarah Trull and Senior Associate Dean Chris Clemens. They've hosted virtual events with speakers of different viewpoints tackling the challenging issues of our time. On September 10th, Robbie George and Cornell West spoke on how to foster dialogue and friendships across the political aisle. And over the summer, our own Dr. Mike Cohen moderated a discussion on the principles that should guide our lockdown strategies for COVID-19. These events have brought over 400 individuals to these events, each of these events over the past few months. And last, and I'll wrap up, UNC Global and Study Abroad are working with international partner institutions on providing virtual global experiences through a program called Connecting Carolina with the World. This program is unique. It's one of the reasons that we will remain a leading global public research university, so that we can bring the world to Chapel Hill, but also take our students, even if virtually, out into the world. And it's programs like these that I've described that help us maintain our status as a top 5 U.S. News and World Report public institution. And you maybe saw just last week, the Wall Street Journal ranked us as the 3rd top public university in the nation. And the Shanghai rankings about a month ago ranked us as a top 30 global university, moving up 3 spots in those rankings. So these are important. These rankings help us certainly showcase the great work that we're doing at Carolina. Finally, I just want to take a moment to welcome Amy Johnson, our new Vice Chancellor for Student Affairs. Amy started on August 3rd, and you might just say was thrown into the deep end when she arrived, and she's done an incredible job as we brought students back shortly after her arrival. And I think we'll hear more from her a little bit later, but I'm looking forward to the rest of the meeting, and I just want to thank all of you for your support, and I'll turn it back to Chair Stevens.
Thank you, Chancellor. And again, thank you for all you and your team are doing. We'll now proceed to our committees, and we'll start with the Finance, Audit, and Infrastructure Committee and Trustee Cochran.
Thank you, Chair Stevens. Excuse me for my congestion. Before we turn it over to Nate to walk us through the rest of the agenda, I'd like to recognize Dean Weber, who will lead us through a review of the internal audit charter and the charter governing finance, infrastructure, and audit committee actions. Dean?
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Chairman, board members, and guests. Before the committee is an action item seeking endorsement documenting review and approval of the Office of Internal Audit Charter and the Finance, Infrastructure, and Audit Committee Charter. The action item is marked as Attachment C within your agenda materials. The charters formalize operational parameters of Carolina's internal audit function, including rights and obligations, the reporting line, authority, independence, and expectations of the internal audit operation. The charters establish rules and responsibilities for the organization's function and related oversight provided by this governing committee. As defined in the Finance, Infrastructure, and Audit Committee Charter, the primary audit-related function of the committee is to assist the board in fulfilling its responsibilities related to the integrity of the university's financial statements and other financial reporting, the adequacy and effectiveness of internal control systems, and the independence and performance of both external and internal audit functions. The charter also outlines expected operational responsibilities of the committee. The Office of Internal Audit Charter speaks to expectations of the university's internal audit function and includes topics addressing independence and objectivity, the scope of internal audit activities, reporting, monitoring, and specific responsibilities in my role as the Chief Audit Officer. Both charters were last reviewed in September 2019, and no content revisions are proposed at this time. Carolina's Office of Internal Audit operates in compliance with the international standards for the professional practice of internal auditing, and that is disseminated by the Institute of Internal Auditors. Conformity requires recurring documented review and approval of these governing charters by the university's audit committee and the chancellor. Before you consider the motion to endorse the charters, I'd be happy to address any questions if there are any.
Are there any questions for Dean? We will review and ask for approval of these two charters at the end of our committee meeting. Now I'd like to turn it over to Nate Knuffman, who will lead us through two action items and several reports and updates that come before this committee. Nate?
Thank you, Chair Cochran. Good morning. This item is a designer selection for Carrington Hall Nursing. Trustee Kobe represented the board in this process. You can find the supporting information and committee recommendation in your board materials. This item does require action by the committee. I'm happy to address any questions.
And once again, we will ask for approval of these action items at the end of the committee reports. Nate?
Sure. Chair Cochran, should I go ahead and move to the leases?
Yes, please. I think the trustees know that we have delayed action on the construction manager at risk selection for the Keenan Flagler Business School. We'll have more on that between now and the next meeting.
The next two items are property acquisitions by lease. The first is a renewal of an existing lease by the Carolina Institute for Developmental Disabilities. The second is a restructured agreement for the Teach Autism Program and Carolina Institute for Developmental Disabilities. Both leases are expected to generate substantial savings compared to existing costs. These items do require action by the committee, and I'm happy to address any questions.
If there are no questions for Nate, let's move ahead to David Ruth with a development report.
Good to see everyone. TJ's pulling the slides up. I will say as we get started, development continues to be extremely busy. A little hard to imagine you can continue to do, thank you. Barely do, but the team has made an extraordinary effort and pivot. We actually have a wonderful event this afternoon with private equity and venture capital alums in New York. And those are the kind of things we can actually do very successfully. We've taken Kevin to San Francisco like we traditionally would, taking him to DC, taking him to New York. So the development activity continues to be extremely busy. So let me give you a quick report. TJ, next slide. All right, next slide. So this is traditionally the meeting where we take a deep dive on the fiscal year end results, and that's what we're going to do today. We do have updated numbers through September 6th, so this is showing the first 2 months of the new fiscal year. This is where we sit now in the campaign at 3.4, a little bit over $3.4 billion, which means we have $850 million left to go in 2.5 years. If you look at the number right in the middle of the screen, months ahead of schedule, we came into COVID about 9.2 months ahead of schedule, and we're hanging on by our fingertips with 8.9 months ahead. So that's actually extremely encouraging. Continue to be very pleased with the breadth of donors in the campaign. If you look on the far right-hand side, We always update you on the individual unit progress to their campaign goals. And if you see, we have a bright yellow triangle at the top on the Adams School of Dentistry, who has now met their campaign goal, which is very positive. We have other units who have done that as well, including nursing and SILS in terms of our schools. So good progress there. Next slide, TJ. You heard the big number, but the number was $564 million for this past fiscal year. That is coming off two $600 million years in the previous 2 years. The third year ago was our public launch year. We were pleased to hit 600 again. This past year, actually had a working goal with Kevin for $550 million of total commitments this year. And we're lucky enough to close the year strong and have a very strong year at 564. The next slide. This is a quick snapshot of where we sit with the big signature initiatives that we're talking about in the campaign. As you know, the Carolina Edge goal to raise money for students and scholarships is a bold goal. Many across the country have $1 billion goal for students. As we're checking around with our peers, I think we might be doing the best job in the country on need-based aid. So 65% of $1 billion goal still has a lot of hill to climb, but we're still pretty encouraged with that number. Look forward to talking to you about some ways that we've repositioned the convergent science discussion across the campus to talk about all the money and work that is being raised for convergent science at Carolina, which allows us to speak from a position of strength. And I think it's going to allow us to sell the Institute in an even better way. So good progress on all the signature initiatives. Next slide. If you'll squint or look at this as carefully as you can, this is individual school and unit performance with some of the bigger units. You can see UNC Health continues to be a real horse in this campaign, really strong. But you can also see in the individual schools and units, and this is something we all kind of need to remember, this is a lumpy business because we get a good bit of our closed gifts in that 5 million and up category. So if a unit nails, 1 or 2 really nice gifts in a year, it's kind of hard to come behind the next year and necessarily grow that amount in a gradual way. UNC Health had a great year. Keenan Flagler is off to an extraordinary year this year. We'll talk about that a little bit later in the meeting. Athletics had the best year ever at $81 million, partly driven by Eddie Smith's gift and Jim Coleman's gift. Scholarships and student aid continues to be strong. We started the campaign raising about $6 or $7 million a year for scholarship and student aid, and we've grown that, and it's had another strong year at $38 million. School of Public Health had a very strong year this year at 33. So, but zigging and zagging is what you hope you get to then create a good number year over year. Next slide. It's always good to remind ourselves of this chart, but this is where we've come in total new cash and commitments. Had we not had a campaign and stayed on the trajectory that line would have predicted, you can see the gold line, and then you can see what's happened in the course of the campaign. That's why you have campaigns. That's why you get very clear about the kind of money you need and are trying to raise. Next slide. One of the things you're going to hear me talking about a lot and our development team talking about a lot is particularly right now raising the right kind of money. And our deans, our chancellor, everybody needs current money that's able to be spent right this second. And so we're going to be making a pivot, doing a lot of training with our team to make sure we're elevating the conversation of current expendable gifts in every donor conversation. Some major gift conversations might have a major gift that's paid in over 5 years, but also a significant expendable gift that's paid up front. That's just doing the right thing that the institution needs at the moment. It's not necessarily the way you drive campaign totals, but let me tell you, I don't think that's the objective in this particular moment. The objective is to make sure we have the cash to run the institution that we need. Speaking of cash, next slide, TJ. Speaking of cash, this past year was the best year Carolina ever had in cash results, inching up to $424 million. And you can see what's happened gradually over the course of that campaign. That's what should be happening in the middle and toward the end of the campaign as you're layering multiple multi-year pay-in gift commitments on top of each other. So I won't kid you, it's not the easiest environment right now with all the uncertainty we have at the donor level, at the institutional level, at every level in our culture and our nation. But we're still not discouraged, and we're still pushing pretty hard. So happy to take any questions if anyone has them.
Mr. Chair. I was just going to say, Dave, that's phenomenal what you all and your team are doing, given the circumstance. To be at this level is just absolutely great. Thank you for all you're doing.
David, I echo Richard's comment. You're doing a fabulous job. The university needs you, and you are responding wonderfully. Thank you.
Chairman Cochran, Vice Chair Pryor has a question or comment.
Yeah. David, this is John Pryor. I'm just curious. I learned last week that the former head of development, the Arts and Sciences Foundation, had left. I was just wondering what the story was there and who the replacement is and what you're looking at there.
Rob Parker is a tremendous teammate. Rob has gotten a really wonderful offer to go to a place called Union College up in New York. It's a great opportunity for Rob to be in my job equivalent there. Terry Rhodes and I and Kevin talked pretty quickly, and the good news is we have, talking about promoting internal talent, we have a leader within that team. Her name is Ann Collins, and it was just announced this week. I actually think that Ann is stepping up into that leadership role. She is really well trusted within that team. She's a great partner across the campus. Ann and I and Terry will be working on the work plan for Ann as she steps into that job, and I could not be happier with that.
Thank you for that. And just one follow-up.
Yep.
How many people total do you have in your development operation now?
John, multiple ways to answer that question. Central development is one answer, and then all the development teams that sit around the entire campus. So you roll up Rams Club, you roll up Medicine, you roll up College of Arts and Sciences. In the center, roughly 145 people on that team, and campus-wide, roughly 350.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Chair Stevens, if I could I just want to thank David and his team. They do an incredible job. The Zoom world that we're living in, the virtual world, really has worked well. They've gotten creative. This idea of Zooming into New York City, Atlanta, San Francisco, Charlotte has worked really well. And David has joked on a few occasions that the ride in from the airport to those meetings is actually pretty nice relative to what we're used to when you're zooming in. So there's some savings there for sure, but David and the team continue to, we're meeting the mark, and I think people care deeply about remaining committed to Carolina. And also want to thank a number of the board members have actually put some really good prospects in front of David and me and others of late, and that's also important. So we're grateful for that.
Any other questions for David? Any other comments? David, thank you again for a fabulous job. Now let's turn it back to Nate, who's going to walk us through some transportation and parking issues.
Thank you, Chair Cochran. This is an update to changes to the transportation and parking ordinance. In July, the board approved use of the Chancellor's emergency authority to implement changes to parking regulations in response to COVID. At that time, we committed to come back to this body and inform you of the changes that were made. The board materials highlight these changes. They included a change to the effective date, reduced pricing to recognize teleworking schedules, and then also a slight change to weeknight parking hours. This item is for information, and no formal action is requested at this time. I'm happy to address any questions.
Don't see any, Haywood.
Sorry, I remained muted. Nate, if you would walk us through the finance update.
Sure. 1 minute while we pull up some slides. For the financial update, my goal today is to provide additional information on our current budget situation and our plans to address our financial challenges. Before I get into that, I'd like to spend a minute on our current budget environment externally and then within the campus environment. So externally, pre-COVID, if I were to describe the situation, it would be one word: challenging. Our governance bodies are asking for and demanding additional transparency. The Board of Governors has published information on financial dashboards. The board has also asked for financial modeling and scenarios in response to changes in operations. They've also asked for additional budget and financial information. We continue to face downward pressure and constraints on our primary revenue sources. Economic uncertainty, which drives the state revenue forecast and our appropriation, is facing a great deal of uncertainty. And recently, the board and legislature have taken a variety of actions aimed at affordability. 3% statutory cap on fees. There have been limitations on tuition increases. There have also been, the NC Promise program has been launched, which has significantly reduced tuition at 3 institutions within the UNC system. Our major rating agencies have recently downgraded the outlook to the higher education sector. And again, they see across the sector a strained financial model. Next slide, please. Here at Carolina, again, pre-COVID, the university had never operated with an all funds prospective budget. We've worked very hard over the last couple of years to establish a common standard framework, to establish a baseline, and to help us better understand our planned revenues and expenses. As you know, our environment is very decentralized, and that has contributed to some of our financial challenges. We have ambitious goals in Carolina Next. Those will require significant investment. And then when you think about our university finances, at the aggregate level, they're very healthy, but that obscures structural issues. And that's, again, pre-COVID. COVID has exacerbated this situation. Our current budget challenge is twofold. One, a structural budget issue, which we estimate to total approximately $100 million. And secondly, COVID-related impacts to our income-producing units, which we estimate to total as much as $200 million. This includes revenue losses already incurred to some of our units such as housing, dining, parking, and campus health. It also includes estimates to those same units for spring 2021 and impacts to patient care and athletics. Taken together, we could see a total impact to the university of $300 million this fiscal year. To put that in context, this is about 8% of our current revenues and in line with the impacts at other peer universities. Importantly, this does not take into account any changes to state revenue reductions. We'll refine this as we continue to monitor and we get more clarity on the spring and our state and federal revenue moving forward. Next slide, please. So with that backdrop, it's useful to look at how those impacts fit within our current revenue structure. Here's a pie chart of our current revenue by source from the 2019 Comprehensive Annual Financial Report, which is the CAFR. And you'll see, first you'll notice that our revenue sources are very diverse. No one source comprises more than 20%. You'll also see our primary sources are federal grants, reflecting the research successful research engine at the university, also patient services, and then state appropriations and tuition, which combined represent about 30% of our sources. And importantly, those are the primary sources that support our instructional mission and also our academic support. You finally see the auxiliary revenues in the 14% area in the sales and services portion. And when you think about the impacts of COVID-19, they're really concentrated in that purple patient services carry in the 14%, the sales and services area where our auxiliary revenue is. To date, tuition revenue has not been impacted and enrollment has remained strong. Also, our state appropriations have not been impacted. Of course, the fund source and location of these impacts will inform how we manage moving forward. Next slide, please. So management moving forward, how are we addressing this current situation? Well, first, it's important to note our strategy to mitigate these impacts began in the spring with implementation of management actions to help address the growing consequences of the pandemic. Next slide, please. You can see personnel actions were put in place, limitations on personnel actions were put in place in March. Becky Mangini will go into more detail on this following this presentation. Also, we put restrictions on non-personnel spending. This includes limitations on travel, new spend, consulting. Then also we postponed capital projects. Previous slide, please. Previous. So these actions helped address immediate impacts. We plan to continue and amplify this moving forward. It's important to note also auxiliary units have put in unit-specific measures in place to help manage. These include reduced hours of operation, reduced services, delayed capital projects, and furloughs. Next slide, please. We also plan to leverage our budget process, which is currently underway, to inform impacts, engage campus leaders in addressing our issues, and evaluate opportunities to reduce expenses or reallocate resources. You can see in terms of our budget process, it initially started, phase one really began last year, meeting with every unit and establishing a common framework for looking at our revenues and expenses on the budget at an all funds perspective. The first phase was really about a common framework and a baseline. Currently in phase two, we have meetings underway and our budget process is in flight. It's scheduled to be done by mid-November. And in this phase, we're planning to go a step further and be able to reallocate and look at resources. Our primary goal is to make progress and address our structural budget issues while aligning our spending with our highest priorities. We are following up with every individual unit on campus to explore and require identification of reduction options as part of this process. Next slide, please. And in terms of decision-making in the process, it's helpful to review some of the guiding principles that will help inform our decision-making. First, we will prioritize the core mission of the teaching, research, and service. Second, we will value and support the university's workforce, and Becky Mangini will again get into this topic a little bit further following my presentation. We recognize that avoiding a one-size-fits-all makes sense, and then we plan to engage stakeholders across campus in this process. With that concludes my presentation. Chair Cochran, I'd be happy to take any questions.
I have a question, please.
I have a question too.
Trustee Duckett.
Nate, thank you. One of the things I think is important to point out here is that some of this prior strategy and how we ended up in some of this position goes back prior to this administration, prior to this group, to prior boards and things like that. And that's not throwing blame, but I want to say that on top of COVID, on top of all the efforts that this administration and the leadership here have put forth to do what we're doing, I'm glad that they're taking it on. I'm glad this board is taking this seriously. It's time to rip off the Band-Aid and let's figure out where we are and fix this thing instead of just coasting it down the road, as they say. So what I want to say is thank you, Nate. Thank you, Bob. Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, Richard, everybody involved here for getting to this so that we can be transparent about it and actually address it, because this is not the time to just keep passing things along. So thank you.
Thank you. There was another question. Trustee Kobe.
Yeah, thank you, Nate, for that presentation. I'm just trying to get better perspective of the items that you mentioned. How much do you estimate that's cutting into the $100 million deficit and the structural deficit? And is there any way to give us a sense of what would be necessary to significantly reduce that structural deficit? What actions would be required?
Great question. The management measures I mentioned about restrictions on personnel, restrictions on non-personnel spending like travel or other areas. Those are yielding some savings, but they're short-term in nature. And we think they've offset something to 30 to 40% of the impact we've seen just from those areas. But again, that's short-term savings. To address the longer-term structural issues that you referenced, we really need to find recurring reductions and recurring changes. That's what we are using our budget process and really leveraging that process to understand where we may be able to strategically inform reduction scenarios and options that could address that.
Thank you.
Other questions, comments? Trustee Pryor?
Thank you, Nate. John Pryor. Just following up on what both Trustee Kobe and Trustee Duckett said, and I think that Chuck said not the time to keep passing things along. I just want to strongly echo that going forward, I'm going to be looking to see what sort of recurring revenue cuts there are, recognizing that the $100 million that is sort of a legacy problem is likely going to be remedied at some point. But given the changes in higher education, everything might be more dire than is even forecast today. So I think it's very important that we look at recurring cuts going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Trustee Pryor. Other questions, comments, buddy? Hey, well, I don't see any others.
Can I just?
Oh, I'm sorry, Chancellor.
I just want to jump in for a second and say, I want to also acknowledge and thank Nate Knuffman, because I acknowledged Vice Chancellor Amy Johnson earlier, but as I'm thinking about this is Nate's official first meeting as interim Vice Chancellor for Finance and Operations. And you've done an incredible job. I mean, you've been by my side, our side, for many months as we've worked through it, stepped into this role back about a month ago as Jonathan Pruitt was recruited down to the system office as the COO. So Nate, thank you. And I just want to echo what he has said. We are committed to continuing to restrict non-personnel spending, which there's been significant savings, but as Nate has said, these are short-term. We will continue to review and put a pause on filling vacant positions. And we've been able to do this over the past 4 or 5 months since April. We will continue to review commitments through these 32 budget meetings that we're in the process of. We now have had 7 of these. Provost Bluen and I are dividing and conquering and going into these along with Nate and his team with the financial leads and the deans or institute and center directors. And we're looking very closely at these commitments that have been made over the past 6 or 7 years that have helped to contribute to this structural deficit. And we have got to get this resolved. And then there have been in some of our auxiliary units, as you know, furloughs and salary reductions for some of those auxiliary units. And those are the ones that have been hit hardest up to this point with housing, dining, parking, patient care, with UNC Healthcare, and with athletics. And so we are committed to getting this right. And but we have a lot of work ahead of us with a lot of uncertainty out there. But I just want to thank Nate for all that you and Steve Agostini and members of your team are doing.
Thank you.
And I echo those thanks. Nate, it's been a pleasure to work with you and alongside you, and we desperately need that to continue for all of our benefit. Becky, are you prepared to walk us through an HR update?
I am indeed. TJ, tell me when you're ready.
I'm ready. The floor is yours.
All right. Thank you so much, Chair Cochran. So I think Nate did a really good job of laying out the budget situation. And when we talk about budgets, we inevitably need to talk about personnel, because at UNC-Chapel Hill, about 80% of our overall budget is represented by people. So when we think about personnel actions related to the budget, there are several things we need to consider. Next slide, please. First, next slide. First, we really need to think about what sort of budget deficit we're trying to solve for. Is it a temporary one or a one-time loss, such as the pandemic, like Nate talked about? Or is it a permanent, recurring structural program or problem associated with the loss of permanent revenues or fund sources or some level of overcommitment? We also need to think about what is the size of the budget deficit? How much do we need to cut or adjust to meet our goals? Nate talked a little bit about the different fund sources, and we need to pay attention to what types of monies are impacted. Are these auxiliary funds? Are they state dollars? Are there research commitments tied to these dollars? All of you know that at an institution like ours, we use several different fund sources and many of them cannot replace one another. So knowing what types of money are impacted is really important as we think about the types of tools we want to use to put in place. And then we have to think about what are the tools available to help us reach the goals that we've set. So we have some tools such as temporary base adjustments, furloughs, or fund source swaps, which might help us with short-term, non-recurring problems like the pandemic, but they won't address the structural deficits. Other tools like reductions in force and discontinuations or reducing FTEs or even earlier phased retirement programs can help us manage those longer-term structural issues. Some of the tools are available to us locally. Others require authorization from others, be they the Board of Governors or the General Assembly. Some tools apply to certain employee types and not others, while other tools could apply equally to all employee types. And it's important to remember that some tools are financial and don't require any personnel actions at all. And certainly Nate talked through some of those and we'll spend a little bit more time on those. And right now, one of our biggest tools is not to further commit any resources while we work to understand the full depth of the financial situation. Next slide, please. So right now we're working to understand both the short and the long-term impacts on our budget. And as Nate mentioned, most of the near-term impact has been on our auxiliary and our fee-funded units. As part of the governor's response to COVID-19, state agencies have been provided the authority to exercise what they're calling an emergency furlough provision for those units who have been impacted directly by COVID-19, or rather, let me restate that, for those units whose budgets have been directly impacted by COVID-19. And that is a really important piece because the requirements of this tool are very prescriptive. It has to be about budgets being impacted. And in this case, it really is about auxiliaries and fee-supported units that are being most impacted. The requirements of these furloughs are that they can last up to 12 months. They apply to permanent, full-time, and part-time employees, but not to temporary or student workers, and also not to faculty. Employees can be temporarily placed on a full or a partial furlough or have a reduction in hours or FTE, and they can be granted unpaid leave for all or a part of the time. The important part about this emergency furlough provision is that employees can retain their benefits and their ability to accrue leave, which is really important as we think about the longevity of employees and the idea that we will ultimately get back to some sense of normalcy. On our campus, as you all know, the athletics department has exercised this option, as has the Moorhead Planetarium. And we're having discussions with a handful of other fee supported or auxiliary-based units about plans they might put in place should their situations become further impacted. At this time, though, because, as Nate said, our enrollments are steady and our state appropriations haven't been impacted, this is not a tool that's available to other units that are supported by those types of funds. Next slide, please. So as we work to understand the fiscal impacts of the pandemic and the economic realities associated with limited ongoing funding, as Trustee Pryor talked about, we're evaluating the tools available to us beyond the emergency furlough provision. These tools include things like temporary base adjustments or furloughs, and I tend to use those a little bit interchangeably. The idea is that somebody is given some amount of a base adjustment, which may or may not come with days off. Reductions in FTE, either temporarily or permanently, early retirement programs, and things like reductions in force. It's important to note that all of the tools are highly prescriptive, and truthfully, we have very little autonomy in deciding how to use the tools and relatively little local authority in determining when to use them. This is one of the things that I think really makes our system very different than most private enterprise. As a reminder, we have 3 permanent employee types on our campus. SHRA employees are bound by the State Human Resources Act, and that is governed by the Office of State Human Resources. EHRA non-faculty and faculty are not bound by the State Human Resources Act, but both have policies and procedures associated with their employment types that are governed by the UNC system and the Board of Governance. This separation of governance matters when we think about the tools and the authorities. So at this moment in time, the university really has authority to exercise about 4 tools. And the first one is limiting, it's pretty basic, it's limiting or suspending or freezing HR actions. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Second one is a reduction in force. The third is voluntary reductions in FTE or hours. And the last is temporary base adjustments for EHRA non-faculty. And as I said, we're currently under a temporary suspension of HR actions, and I'll talk about that a bit more as we get to the end. The reduction in force tool, which I mentioned, is helpful to us if we want to think about decreasing our overall staff size. But it does have some limitations to us in cost savings, in that we're required to pay severance and we have to pay a series of costs as we put it in place. And then we're also, under current rules, required to try to find new placement for any employees who are displaced as a result of reduction in force. Administratively, this is difficult when you're trying to create a cost savings, and it's somewhat burdensome. And importantly, this tool cannot currently be used for faculty. Voluntary reductions in FTE or hours is where an employee might say, I only want to work 80% instead of 100%, and then they're paid accordingly. This tool is gaining some traction, particularly among our employees who are caring for children or elders at home or who are managing homeschooling. But figuring out a way to get broad utilization is difficult because this is a voluntary activity. We don't get to tell somebody they're going to 80%. This is somewhat a tool where somebody would have to say, I want to volunteer to decrease my hours. And many units have some concern about this because if 5 people in a unit go down to 80%, they've lost a full FTE and the work has remained. So that's just one of the things we think about with that. And then the last one that's available to us currently is a temporary base adjustment for EHRA non-faculty. That includes our senior administrators and a whole handful of other administrative type across the institution employees. That we have the authority currently to do temporary base adjustments for EHRA non-faculty, but the authority is specific in saying we cannot do it across the board. So we couldn't, for example, give everybody a 5% cut for all EHRA non-faculty at this moment. Other options on the table or other tools that we might like require authority that we don't currently have. So temporary base adjustments or furlough authority for SHRA employees or for faculty require approval from the General Assembly. And the General Assembly has not acted to provide this authority yet this year, and most certainly won't before the election. We don't know at this point in time whether they'll take that up after the election, but we would anticipate that if they did grant the UNC system the authority to put this tool in place, that implementation would only be triggered when enrollments drop dramatically or when state appropriations decline, or there's some combination of those 2 things. Likewise, we also do not currently have an early retirement option available to us. And the authority to grant that option also lies with the General Assembly. We've been advocating for such an option because we know that 36.5% of our employees at UNC-Chapel Hill are eligible to retire in the next 5 years. And we anticipate that an early retirement option, which would be voluntary, would be well utilized and could lessen the overall structural deficit and also could lessen the impact if we have to take other personnel action on other employees on campus. Incidentally, on that topic, since March 1, or roughly when the pandemic began, we've had about 227 applications for retirement, and this number is up about 13.5% over the same period of time last year. And put another way, in those 6.5 months, we've already eclipsed 72% of the total number of retirements of the previous year. And as a general observation, we see retirement spike with an anticipated date of January 1. So this just underscores to us the interest in an early retirement option, and we're hopeful that the General Assembly will consider such an option in a timely manner. And finally, the last tool that we would see as being available would be program reductions or discontinuations on the academic side. And that would be a tool useful for pursuing permanent budget reductions. Those actions require multiple layers of review and approval and may require declarations of financial exigency. And that is an authority that Kevin as Chancellor has, but as with all of these tools, there are certainly costs and limitations to doing so. Next slide. So ultimately, we would be failing in our duties as leaders if we weren't looking at these issues and evaluating the tools. And we certainly need to and are putting all of the options on the table. At this moment in time, however, I think it's fair to say, and based on what you heard from Nate, there are just enough unknowns related to the virus and how both it and the seasonal flu will impact our campus in the semester ahead, what the federal and state responses to the coronavirus might look like, and whether elections at all levels will alter the picture any. We also don't know what state tax receipts look like or what the appropriations will be, and what the impact of our current restrictions on spending and hiring will do to impact our budget situation. So it's important to know that we're looking at all of these things. And it's also important to know that if we have to take any personnel action, that will be forecast. And employees will be given notice. And generally, that would be at least 30 days. At this time, as Nate said, we're also working to limit the HR actions we're making, and I'll provide an update on that in just a second. And we're thinking about ways to leverage the budget process to get at other personnel offsets. We're also, like on the budget process, working to set up guideline or guiding principles to guide our personnel action efforts. And we know that if we have to take personnel actions, we're committed to finding ways to manage our losses in ways that prioritize people and recognize that there are people behind all of these jobs, that reduce our operational expenses and put the focus on the teaching, research, and service components of our mission. When and if that time comes, we will most certainly also work to distribute any personnel related efforts such that those with higher earnings assume a larger share of the burden. Next slide. The next part of my presentation is a bit of a shift in that it's less about the tools of the future and more about what we're doing right now.
Okay, can I interrupt then if you're going to go to another portion?
You've heard about the temporary suspension of HR actions, but I thought it might be helpful to share what that means.
Becky, hold on 1 second. Becky.
Yep.
We have a question from Trustee Brown.
Yeah, I've just, it looks like you're going on to another segment. In your presentation, which I appreciate your providing to us, you have a number of items that you said, are based upon authority, whether it's at the General Assembly, at the Board of Governors. It would be very helpful if you could provide for us a grid or some summary that actually takes the various tools that you're talking about, describing the authority limitations we have, who we would need to interact with, and if this board, and I would say, Mr. Chairman, whether it's University Affairs or the Personnel Committee, can assist the administration on preparing for the tools. I think it would be a shame if we did not all roll up our sleeves together. Not that we will use all those tools necessarily, but at least ensure that we aren't flat-footed as you're already describing. We won't be, but if we can help to ensure that those tools are available to us if we need those going forward. It's just a little unclear, some of which you said we're advocating for. Perhaps this is in Clayton and Chris's category as well. But I feel as a board member, I think we should have a little bit of involvement ensuring that we can help you in making sure we have the nimbleness, at least, perhaps coordinating with other universities within the system and therefore at the legislature. So I'd like to take these from the very good work you've done today at a general level and break it into much more concrete categories, and whether it's University Affairs or personnel, to see if we can help you.
Thank you, Trustee Brown. I think you've just given your Personnel Committee that you chair a new assignment. Governor Powers, are you still on the call?
Yes, I am, Mr. Chairman.
I'm thinking there was discussion last week at the Board of Governors about this very topic, and I don't recall whether you all took action or just had discussion. Do you recall that conversation?
I actually think that was in Personnel Tenure Committee, which I was not in. So I don't recall the details, but I don't think we took any action on it, though.
Okay, thank you. I know there was some discussion. So Trustee Brown and others, there's some similar thoughts going on at the board of governors level. So hopefully you coordinate with them as well.
Mr. Chairman, could I also add one thing?
Yes, ma'am.
In addition to the details that Trustee Brown asked, I would ask if Becky could also indicate the timetables for certain of the items. There were certain periods of time of notification or before things could be implemented, that time had to pass. If she could also add that in there so you could just see how quickly something could be implemented or how long you would have to wait before you could roll that out, that would be helpful as well.
Thank you. Sorry for interrupting, Becky. Go ahead. Back to
Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, Trustee Pryor.
I just wanted to ask Becky, I believe she referenced that 36% of employees would be eligible for early retirement in the next 5 years. Just wondering, Becky, if you had a breakdown on how many of those would be fully tenured employees.
I don't have it offhand, and I just want to be clear. It's 36%, 36.5% of employees currently employed are eligible to retire in the next 5 years. They're not all eligible for early retirement because we don't have an early retirement program. And if an early retirement program is introduced, we don't know how much window it will provide, whether it gives people another year or 2 years or whatever it may be. Those are all eligible to retire. So that is a full number. How many of them are tenured faculty, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I can certainly find out. But all of those folks would be eligible in terms of the requirements under the retirement plans. And that includes people enrolled in both the teasers plan and the ORP plan. So that really includes all employee types.
Thank you.
Yep. I'm happy to get some more information. And I will say that I'm also, the information about the tools is something we've had several conversations with the system office about which ones are available to us now, which ones may be coming. I know there is strong interest at the system level and by our other system schools in having the authority to put in place an early retirement program. That is top of the list. And then there has been some discussion about whether or not if a broader flexible furlough or temporary base adjustment authority would be part of a legislative ask. And I haven't heard anything more recently. But that was on the table a couple of weeks ago. So I'll find out more about that and get you an updated list. As we talk a little bit, so the next part of it is really to talk about what we're doing right now. And one of the things that we have the most control over. And we put in place a streamlined process that more heavily engages executive leadership and decision makers in the process, both at the school and the central levels. And while there have always been executive checks and balances, we're now having all actions of all kinds. So that includes hiring and any increases and transitions of all sorts pass through local HR and finance leads. So we're connecting the HR and finance piece. Deans and vice chancellors are getting involved. And then I meet with the chancellor weekly together with my colleagues to ensure that he is part of those decisions. The process looks a little bit like this. So first, units submit a request. And it's an exception request because right now we have a suspension on all actions, and there are a handful of reasons for which units can request an exception. Those generally have to do with, is there a compliance reason that we need to go ahead and move this action forward? Is there a COVID-19 related need? Is there an urgent business need for which we have to get somebody in a role? Or is there a teaching or an instructional need that needs to be met rather quickly? So they submit an exception request with a justification for the action, and they have to confirm at that moment that the dean or the vice chancellor supports it and that they have the funding to support the action. Our Office of Human Resources and the Academic Personnel Office do an initial review, and they often go back and forth and ask a series of questions. Then a secondary review is conducted by the AVC for Human Resources and Interim Vice Provost for Academic Personnel. There's a lot of initials there, I get it. Me and some members of the finance staff, and we walk through every one of the requests and outline if we've got questions, why we might send it back, or why we might, or suggestions for changes, or whether we'll recommend them for approval. The finance leads are then contacted once again to confirm and clarify any questions along the way. And then every Friday, the Chancellor and I, together with the AVC for HR and the interim VP for APO, meet and we walk through all of the actions and either approve or deny or send them back for clarification, alteration, or delay. And we don't know, this is a suspension that was put in place in part by the system, though it was something we had already started to put in place. We don't know how long the suspension as it is will last, but I will say that we anticipate, no matter where we go moving forward, that we will retain some version of this process moving forward. Because one of the things we've realized as part of this is that further coordination between the decision-making units and the finance and workforce commitments has really served us remarkably well, both in this process and more broadly. So I don't know that we'll ask Kevin to sit down every Friday for the end till the end of time to review all of these, but I do think we'll continue to engage deans and vice chancellors together with the finance units more for the long term. Next slide. So the next couple of slides are hot off the press, so much so that they're not in your book. And I had to ask TJ to add the slides because they're not in your materials. I don't like to surprise any of you with data of this sort, but because I just got it, I thought it was really good and I thought you'd be interested. I'll note that some of the information I'm going to share with you is really through the end of last week. And I talk about it as if it's through the end of 3 quarters. Because the quarter doesn't end in the calendar year till next week, I'm going to give you a little bit of insight to this data, but then I will rerun the data at the end of next week once we hit the close of the 3rd quarter, and I'll make sure you get a deck with some additional information. So I think it's important to know that as part of this action, let's see what it's done. In the first 3 quarters of the 2 previous years, between the central HR and the academic personnel offices, we've typically initiated more than 17,000 HR actions. In the first 3 quarters of this year, we've decreased the number of actions by more than 30%. And in the last quarter, that number is down by 40%. That may seem to some of you like we're not cutting our commitments to enough, but it's really important to remember that these actions include also temporary assignments, which has been a really big focus of our effort as we work to pivot. So we've been telling units to hire temporary or time-limited employees, or to provide other employees with small salary supplements to take on additional duties, rather than to hire new permanent full-time positions. This ensures that no long-term commitments are made, and it gives us a chance to get our arms around the financial impacts a little bit more. We also see that EHRA, non-faculty, and SHRA permanent hires are down considerably. EHRA hires over the first 3 quarters are down more than 35%, and in this most recent quarter are down more than 53%. Importantly, the number of hires during the first 3 quarters among EHRA employees is lower than the number of retirements, terminations, and resignations by 38%. And what that tells us is that we're not filling permanent positions at the same rate people are leaving them. The same is true among our SHRA permanent workforce. SHRA hires over the first 3 quarters are down 36% and down 60% in the most recent quarter. Retirements, resignations, and terminations outnumber the number of hires among permanent SHRA employees by almost 100% during the first 3 quarters. This information also tracks because our focus has really been, as we've thought through the exceptions, on limiting administrative hires and really focusing on the instructional mission of the university. And those areas that we have other funding sources coming in, such as research, where there are resources to support the hires, particularly as it relates to COVID-19. Faculty hires are down about 10% over the first 3 quarters, though they have remained a bit more consistent with previous years. But when you think about the fact that our enrollments during the summer were actually up considerably, and our fall enrollments have remained constant, that makes some sense. And also many of those faculty hires, as you well know from previous discussions, were negotiated previously and took effect either this summer or this fall. The number of retirements, resignations, and terminations among faculty exceeds the number of new hires by 30%, suggesting we're still not filling vacant positions. Next slide. The hiring data is really important, but it also, I'll be honest, can be a little bit misleading because it includes such things where a campus employee assumes another university position, and then they leave a vacant position and another employee slides into it, and then that leaves it creates a domino effect. And a more meaningful way of looking at the data might be the posting information for hires, which documents the position vacancy at the time of posting on the university's website. Importantly, the posting for hiring across all employee types is down about 50% over the previous year. In 2018, we posted 125 positions for hire during the first 3 quarters. In 2019, we posted 119 hires. This year, in the first 3 quarters, we posted only 25 permanent faculty positions. 22 of those were posted in the first quarter, largely before the pandemic began, and no permanent faculty positions have been posted in the 3rd quarter of this year. EHRA and SHRA postings are also down about 66% over the previous year. Last year in the 3rd quarter, 354 positions were posted across those 2 permanent employee types. This year, just 51 positions were posted in the 3rd quarter, or just 15% of last year's total. And most of those that were recently posted are supported by the research enterprise, so they have a funding source outside. Again, all of this information seems to track given the focus on the instructional mission as of late. So this information is hot off the press. Again, we're still a week shy of getting to the end of the quarter, but I thought it would be helpful to you to see that when we talk about the tools and the things that we currently have available to us, we're making use of them and we're putting them in place to manage the workforce we have, to pivot to the needs of our community right now and our students and faculty as they're working in a different environment. We need to ensure that our students, our faculty, and our staff are all positioned to do the right work for the right people for the right role at the time. But we're doing so in a way that hasn't directly impacted hasn't required massive furloughs or layoffs, but really has allowed us to take advantage of the structure we have, build out a better way to manage it, and ensure that we are reducing our long-term and our short-term expenditures. So we'll continue to provide you more information on this, but I wanted to give you a little bit of insight as it was hot off the press. And with that, I'll stop and I'm happy to take your questions.
Any questions for Becky?
Chairman Cochran, I don't see anyone asking to ask a question.
Okay, and I want to thank all the presenters in the finance, infrastructure, and audit on the agenda, and thank you for getting us back on track time-wise. And I'd like to use that as a segue into some action items. I think we have at least 3 to take action on, and I will summarize those, and that is the review and approval of the Office of Internal Audit Charter, as well as the Finance, Infrastructure, and Audit Committee Charter. We'll consider those at the same time. We have an action item for the designer selection of Carrington Hall, the nursing school building, and we have pulled the construction manager at risk selection from Keenan Flagler. So we'll go to the 3rd action item, which is the property acquisition by lease. From committee, we have a motion to approve.
Chairman Cochran, Chair Cochran, 1 second. Would you mind splitting that into 2 actions? Would you combine the first one, the audit item, and the 3rd one, the lease item, into 1 vote? And then I'm going to turn the meeting over to Vice Chair Davis, since Trustee Brown and I have a conflict or potential conflict on the 2nd one.
Happy to. You've heard the chair's suggestion. we will respond affirmatively to combining the approval of the Office of Internal Audit Charter along with the Finance, Infrastructure, and Audit Committee Charter with the property acquisition by lease approval, and the committee, the Finance, Infrastructure, and Audit Committee, recommends approval of both of those items.
You have a motion from the chair of the committee. Is there a second?
Second.
Second by trustee Kobe. Further discussion? If not, if you would, please call the roll.
Ms. Artis Neal, yes. Mr. Bolick,
Yes.
Mr. Brown,
Yes.
Mr. Kobe,
Yes.
Mr. Cochran,
Yes.
Mr. Davis,
Yes.
Mr. Duckett, Mrs. Hopkins, Mr. McCullen,
Yes.
Mr. Meekins,
Yes.
Mr. Mosley, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Stevens.
Yes. And now, Vice Chair Davis, would you take over the meeting for a moment?
Thank you, Chair Stevens. The matter before us for consideration is the motion of the Finance, Infrastructure, and Audit Committee for designer selection for the renewal of Carrington Hall, the building which houses our nationally top-ranked public nursing school. The recommendation is for 3 firms in the following priority order: Little Diversified Architectural Consulting of Durham, Lord A. Sargent of Chapel Hill, Perkins Eastman Architects TPC of Charlotte. I'll now entertain a second. Seconded by Mr. Meekins. Any debate and discussion? I'm sorry, second by Trustee Kobe. Any debate and discussion? Seeing none, we'll move into a vote. I'll allow Secretary Artis Neal to do a roll call vote.
Ms. Artis Neal, yes. Mr. Bolick,
Yes.
Mr. Brown. That's right, apologize. Mr. Kobe,
Yes.
Mr. Cochran,
Yes.
Mr. Davis,
Yes.
Mr. Duckett, Mrs. Hopkins, Mr. McCullen,
Yes.
Mr. Meekins, Mr. Mosley, and Mr. Pryor.
And I abstain, Madam Secretary.
Thank you very much, Madam Secretary. Please let the record show that Chair Stevens and Trustee Brown abstained from debate, consideration, and voting on this item. The motion stands approved. Back to you, Chair Stevens.
Thank you, Vice Chair Davis. And Chair Cochran, does that conclude the work of your Finance and Infrastructure and Audit Committee for today?
Yes, it does.
Thank you so much. We'll now turn to University Affairs Committee and Trustee Duckett.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As usual, I do have a couple of comments as we start this. We have a number of things to cover, so I'll be brief. I just want to thank the administration and people, everybody around this university that have shown an incredible amount of dedication and put forth a lot of effort because of the times that we're in and COVID and all the issues that have been coming forward with that. And I know a lot of people have complained and had comments, and that's fine because everybody's welcome to their opinion. But I want to say what's great about Chapel Hill and the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill is a place of doers. And it's about trying to do things the right way. And I love Bob Bluen's line from back in the summer that I will not apologize for trying. I like that because we are trying. People are doing their best. It is a positive place. And there is a big difference in being wrong, and everybody's been wrong at some point during this crisis. Everybody. There's a big difference in being wrong and being purposefully wrong. Nobody's been purposefully wrong here. And I want to just say that people want to be here more than ever. They want to work here. They want to live here. They want to teach here. They want to do research here. And I'm not down like everybody. I have my moments like everybody, but not everybody's down. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to say that. But it is important to realize this is a time that will pass. And I think some of the things that we've talked about in personnel and actions and all these things that we're doing in the budget, we're taking on a lot right now. And I just commend the administration, Kevin, and your team, Bob. I call him the hardest working man in America. And because he's here working all the time, but I want to thank you. So as we move forward, we're going to have an action item at the end that we'll take up, and then we'll have some items in closed session. But the first piece that we're going to start with is the Task Force on Promotion and Tenure report with Ron Strauss and Ann Fox.
Great. Thank you so much for having us here today. I'm here to just share with you what is about a year and a half's worth of work. A large group of faculty and some staff worked together to produce a report that has. Am I not showing up on the screen?
Yes, Ann Fox, please, if you unmute and if you want to start the presentation on the Task Force on Promotion and Tenure. While we're trying to find Ron.
I think, oh, sure. So I think I was able to hear Ron, but I think he's going to give an overview of the task force report. And I believe he was saying that the task force met, it was about a year and a half worth of work. And there was broad representation from across the university. And so we're just here to share with you all that task force report. And then there are just a couple of items related to changes in the tenure policy that are required as a result of the recommendations in the report. And I don't know if we have Ron back to give you a little bit more background on the
Ron, I think you're back up now. If you can unmute and come on.
It looks like Ron just left the meeting.
Uh-oh.
I'll tell you what, let's do then. I'm going to move one forward and we'll come back to this. This is the Zoom way of life at present. So I'm going to have the Vice Chancellor of Student Affairs introduction where we introduce Dr. Amy Johnson, the new Vice Chancellor of Student Affairs. Amy, we're very happy to have you at Chapel Hill. You and I have talked already, but we are hearing great things about your work here so far, and we're excited to be here and would like to make that introduction and have you speak a moment.
Am I visible to the board at this point?
Ron, we're going to go with Amy right quick and come back to you if that's okay.
Okay.
Thank you. Sorry, Amy.
No problem. Thank you so much for having me today. I apologize for the technical difficulties that we're having. While TJ gets up the PowerPoint, I just wanted to again thank you all for inviting me and the opportunity to speak with you today. I am on day 52 of my new role. I think that's the correct number, and couldn't be more pleased to have joined the Carolina family. As some of you may know, I come to you most recently from Eastern Washington University, where I served for more than 7 years as the Associate Vice President for Student Life and Dean of Students. I have a long-standing commitment to public education and access to higher education. I was born in Los Angeles, and I'm the daughter of a mom who was a public school teacher and administrator and taught English as a second language for many, many years. So a value for public education and access is a part of my DNA. Prior to that, I worked for the University of Southern California, where I had a joint appointment as a faculty member at the Rossier School of Education and in Student Affairs as a senior associate dean. So I have taught actually for many years in a remote instruction model, and I'm familiar with online education, which has been very helpful throughout this process with the pandemic. Before USC, I was at the University of Pennsylvania. And so coming back to the East Coast is sort of a homecoming for me. And I loved my time here, and I'm so glad to be with you. In addition to the fact that I am pleased to be working for a top-tier research university where I've spent the bulk of my career. And while also working with an extremely talented, high caliber population of students and serving the access mission, which is so important to me. So on the next slide, if you would, TJ. I know that many of you already have an introduction to student affairs, so I just wanted to spend a brief moment today recentering you with our work in student affairs, which beyond the number of the people on our team and the space that we occupy on campus is all about students. We consider ourselves in student affairs student development educators, as our work is focused on the learning and the holistic development of students. So while our faculty colleagues spend their time focusing in on facilitating learning typically inside the classroom, we in student affairs spend time facilitating student learning largely outside the classroom and then working to make sure those two pieces are interconnected. On this slide, I want to call your attention to two particularly important ways that we do this. One is you'll see we, as a rule, employ more than about 1,300 student staff members who work side by side with us in our residence halls and in our offices. Also, in terms of designing student programs and serving as peer mentors to their colleagues. I often talk with students and parents and family members at orientation about the benefits of getting a campus job as a great way to connect with faculty and staff, to develop a campus network and have regular access to mentors and advisors, and to become a campus insider. We know from research that students who develop these relationships and become engaged with the university are more likely to stay in school, more likely to do better academically, and they're more likely to be satisfied with the experience at the end of it and maintain contact with the university after they graduate. So working directly with us can check all of those boxes in one fell swoop. Additionally, the other item on this slide that is so significant is the number of students who are involved in our recognized student organizations, to which more than 75% of our student body belongs. This too speaks to the level of engagement and connection that our students have at Carolina, which is something about which we should be very proud. And again, reinforces those benefits of engagement that I mentioned earlier. On the next slide, in case not everyone remembers the diverse range of departments in student affairs, I thought it would be helpful to see them all here in one spot. As you can see, whether it's the student engagement opportunities through the Carolina Union or student life and leadership that we facilitate, the social justice initiatives through the Campus Y, the myriad health and wellness resources we offer, or the career education and networking, that we foster in career services, our staff and programs connect with students every single day. In addition, we thought it might be helpful here to highlight the ways in which we directly connect with our strategic plan, Carolina Next. So we have highlighted just 5 of the initiatives in which our work is inextricably linked, so that you can see those 5. But you should know that this isn't an exhaustive list. Ultimately, our work not only advances the historic mission of the university and our ongoing objectives, but is closely tied to our plans for the future and to achieving those objectives. On the next slide, which is really my last real content slide, I have long said that nowhere is our student affairs or skill set more on display than in a crisis. And that has certainly been true during this pandemic. Our experience and expertise helps us lead, helps us mobilize and respond, de-escalate and comfort, and focus on the opportunities to highlight the learning that we can take away from these situations for our students and ourselves and our colleagues. So here I wanted to briefly give you a snapshot of some of the important work that we have been busy doing over the last several months. As you'll see in Carolina Housing, we've provided quarantine and isolation housing to a significant number of students. And our whole team has fostered daily contacts, has facilitated meal delivery, and worked to ensure that students have the information and resources they need to manage their care. I know that much has been said and written about in the news lately regarding the quality of quarantine and isolation housing. And there's no question that it's not a stay at the Four Seasons. But the reality is that we've received a significant positive response from our students about the experience overall, with many appreciative comments about the cleanliness of the accommodations, the quality of the food, and I think most importantly, the caring staff who have helped make the experience, and this is a quote, better than they thought it would be, and also the outreach that they have received from the university. You'll also see that our Dean of Students team has done heroic work to handle the huge increase in student support contacts this year compared to last, including overseeing the distribution of our COVID care kits to students. I expect that many of you, as I do, may hear comments from students, parents and family members, and stakeholders about why we continue to charge fees for the services when students can't access them during this time, including such things as the health fee, student activities fees, rec fees, and others. And I submit to you that the answers to these questions are right before you. We are continuing to charge those fees because we are continuing to offer extensive resources to students. We still do have many students on our campus and are open for business. We still support students through our health center and our Carolina Union and many other locations. For students who wish to access those resources remotely, we're doing that too. We have telemedicine appointments, as you can see here, through our CAPS appointments, which have gone up, not down, compared to the same time last year. For student engagement, we hosted our first ever virtual involvement fair several weeks ago, hosting more than 200 virtual student tables by our student organizations, and more than 550 students participated, which tells us what a success these kinds of events have been, and we're going to continue doing them to make sure that students have ways to connect with us, in addition to offering one-on-one appointments and a number of other resources to connect students. We have more than 300 virtual student events already on the books for this year. And we just hosted our first ever virtual concert last Saturday, in which we had more than 900 views. I know that we don't have a box here highlighting campus recreation, but that team is also hosting outdoor rec opportunities and virtual classes, and is preparing to open up some of our facilities in the next few days in accordance with the governor's recent directive. So our students are continuing to need us in the learning and development engagement opportunities we offer. And I like to joke that we're like the post office. Neither sleet, nor snow, nor hail, nor rain, nor a pandemic is going to stop us from showing up to support them. On the very final slide that I have here, we started by talking about the value of our student organizations. So TJ, if you don't mind advancing to the next. And I thought it would be appropriate that we would close with our student orgs as well. You'll see a quote here from a student leader in one of our organizations addressing how we're all finding ways to connect, to support, and to continue our Carolina tradition of being here for one another. This comment makes me feel very proud to be a part of the Tar Heel family, and I hope it does the same for you. Thank you so much for allowing me to spend some time talking with you today, and I'm happy to answer any questions as your schedule permits.
Any questions for Amy? Seeing none, thank you, Amy. Appreciate it. Look forward to you being here. Thanks for giving us the update. I'm going to keep moving in the update category and come back to Ron and Ann last so that we can actually take the action item under consideration at that point. So I'm going to call on the Graduate and Professional Student Federation President Ryan Collins for the update.
Thank you, Chair Deckett, and thank you to everyone on the Board of Trustees for the opportunity to speak with you all today on behalf of Carolina's 11,000 graduate and professional students. The Chancellor earlier referenced how UNC is teaching more students than ever this fall, and also how our research operations continue and indeed have been in operation since the beginning of June. And I do want to emphasize that graduate students are an essential part of those functions. And I want to acknowledge and recognize the hard work that my classmates and colleagues have been putting into keeping the university going. I also want to highlight and applaud the efforts of those students in the Gilling School of Public Health, as well as the School of Medicine, who have been a part of the university's research in response to COVID-19. And I'll also highlight my own classmates in the law school for a project they've been working on this summer, the COVID-19 Legal Assistance Project, in which they've assisted more than 20 nonprofits here in North Carolina by providing pro bono legal assistance and services, particularly as they've navigated funds from the CARES Act and things of that nature. TJ, if we can go to the next slide, please. So I've chosen a few just select updates of things that we've been working on as an organization over the past few months. Of course, not an insignificant amount of our time has been devoted to participating in conversations and advocacy around the pandemic and around the fall opening plans. And I'm grateful to the Chancellor and the Provost and others in the administration for being included in these conversations. Another major area that we have been focused on in the fall has been our voter engagement campaign. As you can see, I'm sporting my I voted sticker because I did submit my mail-in ballot earlier this week, and I would be remiss if I did not encourage everyone in this meeting to do the same as soon as possible. But we do have several students on our team that have been working on this, on compiling information related to voter registration deadlines and the various ways that you can vote in the upcoming election, with an emphasis on voting by mail. This has included a targeted email campaign, as President Mosley mentioned earlier, a social media outreach. We've been encouraging participation in the census, as many of our students do live locally and therefore wouldn't be captured in any on-campus data collection that was done. And we are also planning to co-host a debate for the North Carolina Senate election alongside the Stone Center here on campus in the coming weeks. And because we feel it's also important that our students are educated about the candidates whom they're voting for. Next item I want to mention here is our racial justice working group. Of course, we are all familiar with the events and the ongoing concerns around racial justice nationwide and right in our community. We created our own working group internally within GPSF that is looking at focusing on ways that we as an organization are supporting our Black, Indigenous, and students of color, especially interested in what we are doing as an organization to ensure that these populations have the resources that they need to be successful, and elevating more of those students from these communities into positions of leadership within our campus community. We focused a lot of attention on international student support, and this is arguably one of the most negatively impacted populations in terms of our graduate and professional students. A number of them, particularly newly admitted students, have been unable to come to the U.S. Due to travel restrictions, and consequently that impacts their ability to have teaching and research appointments on campus that help pay for their education. In particular, this summer when we had the DHS proposed rule that would have revoked visas for international students who were not enrolled in in-person classes. We actually signed on to an amicus brief that was filed by graduate students at Harvard and MIT, expressing opposition to that rule, and fortunately that was rescinded, but it's just one of the ways in which we have been working to support that population. You see the next item here regarding graduate student stipends. There are there are wide disparities between what we see different graduate RAs and TAs are paid across campus depending on their program. And it's been a priority of GPSF for many years to try to get those minimum stipends increased, so that all of our graduate students are able to earn sufficient income to support themselves and in many cases their families during the 4 to 6 years that they're here at UNC. I know this is a really difficult time to be talking about these types of conversations given the budget constraints we heard earlier, but I'm grateful to Provost Bluen for engaging in these conversations with us and keeping this issue in mind as we think about how the pandemic and the economic crisis are impacting our community. I will highlight one quick project from this summer. We got a number of different programs, but our Director of Public Service, Elena Vodrascu, is a PhD student in psychology and neuroscience, put together a series of COVID support bags and informational materials that they then distributed to families in the community. So we're very grateful to her for that work. And I think that we skipped a little bit ahead on my slides. So if we can go back, TJ, to the COVID concerns, the previous slide. So President Mosley did mention earlier that students have been feeling a lot of fatigue as a result of the pandemic and the impact on our education in Carolina. Graduate and professional students were in that same situation. We were feeling that fatigue, but there's a number of other concerns, obviously, that we're thinking about, which I've highlighted here. There's concerns for physical and mental health, social isolation, the ability to make progress towards degree, given limited access that occurred over the summer to labs and libraries and field research, ensuring that adequate funding remains in order to complete those degrees. So a lot of concerns, especially in the professional schools, about the quality of education, where the experiential component is very important. I know that has been my experience at the law school and the challenges of some of the experiential components of that education that are very hard to replicate in a Zoom environment. But nevertheless, I really want to commend the work of the faculty in our respective programs to make the most of the situation that we're in. I know they're trying very hard to do that. I also want to thank Dean Barber and the folks at the graduate school for their efforts to try to mitigate these negative impacts as much as possible and showing flexibility and support for students during these times. And then next slide, TJ, if we can. And lastly, just looking ahead, we're going to continue to be focusing on racial equity and support for our marginalized populations on campus. We are really trying to increase and develop our relationships with the local community, given so many of our students do live out in Chapel Hill and the surrounding areas and spend a significant portion of our time there. We actually have the chair of the Orange County Board of Commissioners coming to our next Senate meeting on October 6th to talk about ways students can get involved in their community. Reese mentioned, or President Mosley mentioned earlier, the Campus Community Advisory Committee. I'm also sitting on that. I'm grateful for that opportunity to continue to be involved in conversations related to university operations amidst the pandemic. And then this last item that's in terms of our projects is that we have created or convened a new committee called the Future of the GPSF Committee. And the purpose of that is really to look at GPSF over the next 5 years. Is our organization currently meeting the needs and the things that our constituents are concerned about? Are we structured in a way that is most conducive to being able to appropriately advocate for and represent those students? So I'm excited about that work. I think it's an interesting time to be thinking about it, given the unique challenges that we're facing of how we continue to grow and as an organization. And if any of you are in need of a hike, October 3rd, we're going to be heading over to Eno River State Park for a socially distant outdoor hike. There might be a free water bottle in it for you if you want to join us for that. And so with that, I'll conclude my remarks and of course, happy to answer any questions.
Ryan, thank you. Any questions for Ryan? That was a really thoughtful update. Thank you. Next, I'd like to call on Dr. Mimi Chapman for the faculty update.
Chairman Stevens and Trustee Duckett and all of the trustees, thank you for allowing me to speak with you today. I appreciate your time and your concern for the faculty. I must confess that I've been thinking about what to say to you today about the state of the faculty. Like so many across the country, we're deeply concerned about the continuing pandemic and the impact it has had on our daily lives, our work, our students, and on our staff colleagues. Like all of you, faculty members do not exist in isolation. Many have young children at home and are trying to navigate complicated school schedules or supervise children's remote learning from home. Many have children in college and are watching the impact of various approaches that different institutions have taken and how that is affecting the lives of their young adult children. Still others are caregivers for elders, and many have suffered grave losses throughout this pandemic, both relatives, parents, and friends who have been significantly affected by COVID-19 over the past 6 months. In the midst of all of this, we are trying to help our students navigate remote learning, their own challenges, and I understand that referrals to the campus mental health program CAPS are up 25%. While balancing twin concerns of the ongoing health crisis and the potential budget crisis that will be made worse if there is no return to residential learning, and yet we know that the pandemic will not be solved by January. Yet as a group, we press on quite successfully with bringing and securing research dollars, creating the most engaging class experiences that are possible, and listening to our students as they worry for their futures and voice concerns over the ability for justice and positive change in a world that often feels like it is coming apart at the seams. The Chancellor has created a new campus and community advisory board, which you've already heard referenced, to bring more voices to the table as we consider the spring semester. I am honored to co-chair this group with Shana Hill of the Employee Forum and with Reeves Mosley, the student body president. We had our first meeting on Tuesday, and it was so clear that this was the right thing to do. The quality of conversation among 25 plus people on Zoom, many of whom had never met, was so high and demonstrated to me the deep commitment that faculty, staff, students, and community members have to this institution. As the Chapel Hill campus, I know that can arrive at good solutions for the spring semester if we are given the latitude and support to do so. As we move toward the spring semester, I would ask that you support us in designing a plan that is right for the Chapel Hill campus and community, and a solution that is right for the long term, not one that simply solves a problem right now only to create other problems down the road. We want our faculty to stay here, not be lured by other places that can perhaps pay them more and where they believe their voice will be more valued. We want to figure out creative ways to give our students what the experience that they chose Carolina for, including opening up options like study abroad to countries where students can safely study in person. Further, as an institution, we have to show our staff that we are committed to them and not cast them off to create an orderly balance sheet. I know I am chair of the faculty and it is not my job to speak for students or staff, but the truth is, as much as we may want to deny it, we all rise and fall together in a public health crisis of this kind. We appreciate so much that you as trustees are part of our flotilla and stand willing to provide any information that you may need as you advocate for our campus. Thank you again for having me, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mimi. Questions for Mimi? Mimi, I don't see any questions. I would like to say one of the encouraging parts out of all these troubling times is that the students want to be here. They want to be with the faculty. They want the faculty to be there with them in the room when possible. And I think that's something you got to hold on to, because we have a great faculty at this university, and that is what really does make this university special. So thank you.
Thank you for saying that. I wholeheartedly agree.
Thank you. I'm going to move on to the employee forum update and Shayna Hill.
Good afternoon, and thank you for letting me share remarks on behalf of our incredible UNC staff. This summer, staff were given an impossible challenge. They sacrificed sleep, weekends, family, vacations, mental health, and some even took pay cuts. Sadly, some even got sick. And after this, staff are getting lost in the blinding light of national media attention and the incredible spin of finger pointing and blame. But let me be clear, staff do not have this luxury, as we are staring down the very real possibilities of sickness, more furloughs, pay cuts, and layoffs. We are seeing businesses that have been in our community for decades close, and we are not naive enough to think that the university will not be similarly affected. So finger pointing to staff is precious time lost. It is more important right now that without delay, we begin to create a plan for the spring to ensure that staff do not continue to get sick. It is important that staff do not continue to be the only employee population to take pay cuts. It is important that staff are recognized and rewarded for their heroic efforts this summer. And most of all, it is important for the rest of the community to hear them when they say they feel lost, forgotten, and unappreciated right now. All of these things are so important so that we can focus and pivot and strategize around the difficult but important work of saving lives and saving jobs. Thank you, Chancellor Guskowitz, for allowing me to co-chair the Campus and Community Advisory Committee so that staff can be a part of this important work. Staff are not just my colleagues. These are my friends. These are the people that have lifted me up. And they are also the people that have lifted up this university. They are the people that spent countless hours to support the mass migration of work functions off campus, that helped redesign classes, that are currently reworking financial aid packages, that are working in a healthcare system that is stretched to capacity, and that are literally keeping our buildings running and cleaning up after us all. The highest honor the Employee Forum awards every year is the Three-Legged Stool Award. The three legs represent staff, faculty, and students. Without all three, the stool would support nothing and it would topple. As we look forward to plans for the future and create a better way forward, please let us remember to bolster all three. It is also important to note the groundbreaking work of the Employee Forum during this difficult last 6 months. For the first time in the university's 227-year history, there will be a staff award given at University Day. The Rebecca Clark Staff Award for Moral Courage. Rebecca Clark, a former UNC-Chapel Hill staff member, African-American political activist, and civil rights organizer, fought against unequal pay and workplace discrimination. Clark worked briefly as a housekeeper at the Carolina Inn in the late 1930s, and again in the 1950s as a nurse until her retirement in 1979. She worked with administrators to obtain affordable housing for Carolina's lowest paid employees. Clark died in 2009, and as a result of her efforts, the university named the Cheek Clark Building, formerly the University Laundry, after her and Keenan Cheek, organizer of the Janitorial Association. Clark is indeed an important figure in the university's history. The inaugural 2020 Rebecca Clark Staff Award for Moral Courage goes to James Holman, a crew leader in housekeeping services. His nominators wrote, James Holman's work advocating for the staff of UNC-Chapel Hill and the UNC system is truly a round-the-clock effort. Mr. Holman is a third shift employee, but instead of resting during his personal time, he can often be found advocating for his fellow staff members at meetings of the UNC Employee Forum, the UNC Staff Assembly, and the State Employees Association of North Carolina. We are incredibly proud of Mr. Holman and eternally grateful for Chancellor Guskowitz for adding the Rebecca Clark Staff Award for Moral Courage to the University Day celebration. Also, during the last 6 months, the Employee Forum, in partnership with University Communications, created our first public service announcement regarding mask wearings, featuring such notables as Charles Streeter, the UNC Employee Forum Chair Emeritus, and Coach Roy Williams. We thank them both for participating in this important project. Again, I thank you for your time today, and I am happy to answer any questions.
Questions for Shana? Shana, I want to thank you. You continue to be an inspiration for the staff and for the entire university. As I was walking this morning, I noticed how many of the staff are out working and smiling and pleased to be here as well. And they're very, very, very important to this university. So thank you.
My pleasure.
Okay, we'll go back to the Task Force on Promotion and Tenure report from Ron Strauss and Ann Fox. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. And sorry for any technological problems that occurred. I'm here to talk with you about a task force report which has taken about 1.5 years to come to this point, with 21 faculty members and senior staff working on it. This is a document that is dedicated towards making and permitting a more competitive, nimble faculty to allow us to attract, recognize, and retain faculty talent. In this report, which you have in your Exhibit 2, you will find 49 recommendations, many of which are on the way towards implementation. We wanted to share them with you. We will make a request that some specific changes happen, and Ann Fox from the Attorney's Office joins me today to put those specific recommendations about what we call the 18-month rule in front of you. But I assume you all have the report, and I'm here to answer any questions.
I would imagine there's some questions from this report. So anybody have any they'd like to bring forward for Ron?
Chairman Duckett, is this just limited to your committee, or are you going to make this open to other members of the board for questions?
Oh, no, this is open for anyone for questions.
I have a question, if it's okay.
Sure.
I just would ask for the, I know that it has been a policy and it has been utilized in this university community and across other university communities. There's a provision in the retention part of faculty tenure. We're dealing with the tenure report, correct?
Right.
Regarding the emphasis on hiring spouses. And I'd love to hear some rationale on the utilization of hiring spouses as a way to retain other professors, and why that is because in all frankness, we've had recent problems with that particular invocation of policy.
So I'm glad to address that. Our spousal hiring program has been with us for many years. And we actually try to retain faculty members where there is a spouse who is seeking academic employment by trying to place that spouse into a career. We do that not just on our own campus, by the way. We do that with our neighboring and sister schools around both the UNC system, with Duke University, and with a number of other private universities in the area. That's a tool for bringing faculty here, but it's also a tool for keeping faculty here, especially faculty members who have added a partner during their time here on our faculty. And the interesting thing about this is it has actually resulted in bringing very remarkable talent to our campus. And recently, we've had a person who came in as a spousal hire who was the object or subject of an attempted recruitment by another major university. And when we looked at it, we realized in some regards, the spouse was performing at an extremely high level and was someone we really wanted to hold on to. So the reason it's in this report is that the existing policy is only that we use spousal hiring for new faculty members. But as we have learned, many faculty have new partnerships and new spouses while they're here, and it allows us to extend to those.
Jeff?
Yeah, I don't know. Chuck, I'm not sure how much time we do. We have a few minutes?
We're in good shape.
Okay.
This matters.
I just had a couple of questions, and maybe one of them, Bob, maybe for you as well. There were some elements that I thought were great to try to get it nimble, and the variable track piece that I noted in the report seems to make a lot of sense as a sort of a midpoint in being able to plan for fixed term to be able to be extended. The 18-month elimination seems to make sense for being nimble in certain instances. So those were things I applauded. One is a high level question. I realized this was underway when Carolina Next was put in place. And Bob, you may speak to this. I didn't really see a lot of, obviously we're trying to get our top talent. That's what's driving this. But it may be that that's just enough that needs to be implemented. But how much was Carolina Next and the goals a part of the discussion? Am I even on the right track there? Because that seems to be something that would have been embedded a little bit more in the materials we had. And then I just had one or two kind of more specific questions. I did see where Carolina Next did have an implementation dealing with underrepresented minority faculty, which was, I noted that, and that seems to be pretty directly from the report, but it'd be great to hear a little bit more.
Yes, so I would say that the rewrite was not necessarily driven by Carolina Next. I think it was driven primarily to make sure that we as a university can be as competitive as we possibly can in recruiting and retaining the very best talent in the country. However, having said that, if you look at the 8 strategic initiatives, the benefit of this change touches almost all of those, whether it be in strategic initiative 1, building our community together, or mounting a highly competitive research enterprise. So I would say that the spirit of the Carolina Next lives in this document, but it was not necessarily created explicitly to address the strategic plan.
One other more specific question is reference to comparisons to peer institutions. And one thing I wanted to just point out, or just at least ask a question. We have sort of the rule of thumb, subject to numerous appropriate exceptions, of the 4 years of duration. At least that's how I read the report. Has that changed? Has that been constant? This is the movement for 4 years prior to tenure recipients being awarded. And how are we in that regard? There's discussions sometimes you hear we're moving more toward fixed term, hence the variable track element. Just a little bit more sense of that. It seems like that's constant with what we've had, but I may be wrong. I'd be interested to know how we compare in that 4 years. I will let you know it's very dangerous to compare disciplines clearly across private sector into the university sector. But frankly, partnerships and efforts to become vested in other disciplines actually are taking longer than they used to because there are numerous other tracks that people have. I'm getting at really where's the state of play, if I could, on the whole tenure conversation.
I think at the national level, all of the universities are trying to use the various options of the different track systems for faculty to primarily recruit the very best people to do the job that needs to get done. So the question is, what is the job that needs to get done? And what is the right kind of track or talent that would necessarily be best in alignment with that particular job to be done? And so, for example, in the fixed term faculty population has grown probably disproportionately to the other faculty categories. And that growth has primarily occurred in the health sciences schools, for example, where the School of Medicine and several of the other schools have recruited clinicians in a more flexible track or basic research scientists into those more flexible tracks. And they were done that way primarily to enhance their competitiveness. So what we're trying to do is to make sure that there's proper alignment in terms of the kind of talent that we need, for example, clinicians or basic researchers who perhaps are not as interested or as skilled in the breadth of the mission of the university and qualify for a tenure track, which would be an individual who is committed to not only pursuing research and teaching, but also service within the university. And so we're trying to make sure that we stay in alignment with the marketplace and with our peers.
On the 4 years, the challenge might be that you have a 4-year rule of thumb. You have exceptions to that to get at this competitiveness. But the degree of discipline that you have as it relates to the years and whether the basic benchmark should be moved in a different direction while you also retain the nimbleness to attract the top faculty.
Yeah, so we have the 4-year allocation of time is really for incoming new people starting at the base of an assistant professor position. And so they're given 4 years of time within our university to develop, to mature. And that gives us enough time to sort of give us a glimpse as to whether or not they are making solid progress. Then there's another 2 years that is added to that in which they have additional time to get their portfolio in shape and to get their own demonstration of their readiness to become an individual for consideration of promotion to tenure. So that's in the tenure track, that 6-year up and out profile is primarily directed towards tenure track faculty, and it's broken down into those 2 components, the first 4 years and then the second 2 years. And that gives the university, the department, the school, enough time, we believe, in most cases, to make a determination as to whether or not that person is worthy of consideration for tenure.
If I might just add something, we're increasingly seeing faculty who had previous careers, either as faculty members or as postdocs or private sector investigators. And so we're trying to build in some flexibility so that we can utilize the work from that previous career in assessing the quality of the faculty member.
And so, Ron,
Can you explain that a bit, Ron? I'm sorry. I didn't mean to cut you off, Kevin.
No, I was just going to say, Ron, if you can just maybe elaborate a little as to why the word, I think that's why the word ordinarily has been recommended as an addition there, so that these exceptions can be considered, and perhaps what percentage of cases do you anticipate would need some alternative period of time?
So I would say most of our faculty want the full 7-year period as a pre-tenure assistant professor before they come up for tenure. It is the rare individual who either had a previous faculty experience at another university or came out of another career that have actually quite a bit more than 7 years of life experience to apply towards a tenure decision. And so what we're allowing this to include is the full body of their contribution and work, not just and only the work that happened here on the Chapel Hill campus. It allows us to bring in a more diverse faculty and to recognize them and promote them at a more reasonable rate. The problem is also that when you don't do that, other universities start recruiting them. And so this is one way to recognize talent and move talent up here at Carolina. I hope that answers that.
Ron, one thing I would like you to address, if you would, or Bob or Kevin, but in some of the, and you mentioned it with the diverse faculty and the understanding of tenure track versus fixed term. And I have seen an accusation in the past in writing that related to pushing faculty towards fixed term versus tenure track. And it was a comment that was made, and I did place a call on it, but I would like to make sure that we're tracking this and understanding this by, for diversity's sake, but so that we're using actual numbers of what we're doing in each case moving forward so that we can answer questions, because it becomes a charge of systemic racism. But we actually have quite a more diverse faculty than we've ever had. But I think it's imperative that we understand, are we pushing anybody towards a track? And is that charge or is that request valid or not? I think it's very important for us to look at that going forward. If either one of you would like.
Yeah, I can start and Ron can add. I would say that we do not push faculty into one track over another. That is a career choice that most faculty make early on in their life as to whether or not they want to pursue in academia a tenure track position or a more focused fixed term kind of faculty position that allows them to focus in on their teaching or their research or some other area of specialization. And so I would say that we do not do that at this institution, push or force or encourage. What I would say is that there has been some natural changes or evolution within our academy, and more so in some schools than others, that have perhaps shifted the percentage of faculty who may be in tenure versus non-tenured type of academic appointments.
One of the things I do want to add is that the variable track will allow people to grow and develop in their career and allow them the flexibility to either go towards the fixed term or go towards the tenure track, depending on the needs of the institution and their own career aspirations. And that level of flexibility is actually a remarkable innovation that's occurring in this document. And I think it'll be a real enhancement in our ability to bring very talented, especially young faculty to the university.
Thank you, Ron. So if that's the report, are there any other questions for any of the people involved with this report from the board? Okay. Seeing no further questions, I would like to ask for a motion for approval for the task force promotion and tenure report.
So moved.
We have a motion from Trustee Hopkins. that right?
Yes.
And your second?
Second from Trustee Cochran.
Cochran, second. Further discussion, debate? If not, if you would call the roll, please.
Ms. Artis Neal, yes. Mr. Bolick,
Yes.
Mr. Brown,
Yes.
Mr. Kobe,
Yes.
Mr. Cochran,
Yes.
Mr. Davis,
Yes.
Mr. Deckett,
Yes.
Mrs. Hopkins, Mr. McCullen,
Yes.
Mr. Meekins,
Yes.
Mr. Mosley, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Stevens.
Yes. Motion passes, and Chair Duck, does that conclude the report from your committee?
Well, one little thing. If our attorney can just introduce the change to the 18-month rule, there might need to be a separate vote on that. Anne, can you just comment, please?
Sure. So we have a memo that kind of points you directly to the two changes that we're requesting approval for. The first has already been discussed, the change to insert ordinarily for the probationary term. And the second is to eliminate what we call the 18-month rule. So the requirement that a faculty member be at the university for 18 months before they can be promoted. So those came from the task force report, but they are changes to the Board of Trustees policy on promotion and tenure that we would request that the board consider.
And I apologize, but I considered that part of what we just approved. So if that's not correct, then we can vote on that separately. Richard, I'd ask for you to.
That was my assumption as well. Let me make sure the maker and the second of the motion did from the maker, Trustee Kelly.
I was including that.
And Haywood, that was your understanding as well from the seconder?
Yes, it was.
Without objection, then we've already taken vote to include both acceptance of the report and the specific amendments.
Great.
Thank you.
That's really clear.
I would like to thank everyone. The reports were very thorough, and this write-up for this report for the promotion and tenure were all the detail was there, and I thank everyone for their questions, and that does conclude university affairs other than some items that we'll cover in close later. Thank you.
Thank you, Trustee Duckett. Let me ask the will of the group at this point. We haven't had a break. Some of you have chosen to do individual breaks. We have two items that I understand will be brief in the next committee, and then we'll need to break for going into executive session. You want to break now or wait?
I promise to stick to the time allotted to each other.
Okay. Let's, if you need a break, just take it. Let's go ahead and finish the last committee, and then we'll have a break at before a closed session. So let me now recognize Trustee Davis for a report of the External Relations Committee.
Thank you, Chair Stevens. I'd like to recognize Vice Chancellor Clayton Summers for a report from Public Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will give the type of report that you all like, and I do too, and that is a very brief one. At the federal level, as you all may be aware, the fiscal year ends September 30th, and absent a continuing resolution passed by Congress, the government will shut down. Fortunately, despite all the misgoings on in Congress, the House this week had passed a CR that would last through December 11th. The Senate is expected to pass that next week, and the president is expected to sign. And that would keep funding going through December 11th past the election. So it is nice, at least one thing we don't worry about right now is a shutdown of the federal government, at least until December. One of the things that our federal affairs team has been doing is we're in the relationship business, not unlike what David Ruth's team does. It's very hard when you can't go to DC for 6 months to maintain relationships. So just special kudos to Kelly and Roxana for completely revamping how they do their business. They're on the phone every day, on Zooms every day, working very hard to advocate for Carolina, and we appreciate that. At the state level, you may be aware the General Assembly came back earlier this month for a quick 2-day session. The purpose was to allocate the remaining $1 billion or so in federal funds they had through the CARES Act. They had been hoping that they could get some flexibility from Congress in terms of using that for revenue replacement. That flexibility was not given by Congress, and they had to go ahead and allocate that money before the use it or lose it of December 31st would come and go. So with regard to the UNC system, the system got an additional $5 million to the Board of Governors for COVID-19 testing, tracing, enforcement, and healthcare services, along with $13 million to purchase PPE for system institutions. At this point, we don't think the General Assembly comes back before January the 13th for their start of their traditional long session. The only hiccup of that could be that if federal government does decide to act in the month for the election, which is unlikely, and does provide additional funds, then you could see the governor call the General Assembly back for a special session, although we don't think that's likely. Therefore, the most likely outcome is the General Assembly reconvenes with a new General Assembly in January. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Vice Chancellor Summers, and thank you to you and your team for your continued advocacy at both the federal and state level. I'd now like to turn it over to Vice Chancellor Joel Curran for an update from communications.
Thank you, Chair Davis. TJ, I'm only going to need one slide, and it's it would be just that second slide in. So I just want to open by thanking everyone for your time. I will be brief. I know a lot of questions come to me often during these times when we have so much activity happening, and they just assume that it consumes my team and we're unable to really do the proactive work that we love to do to talk about the achievement and the work that's going on in this campus at our faculty, students, and our staff. And I just want to let you know that, through these events come opportunity. So I call this the COVID era. Obviously, this has been something that we've been grappling with as a university at every level, but we've taken it and turned it into an opportunity. And I just want to share with you, next slide back, TJ, I'm sorry. Right there. Yeah, thank you. If you take a look at these numbers, it shows you what our core content team has been able to do. Now, of the groups that I oversee, and it's a very diverse portfolio, only about a quarter of that team actually produces content and handle media relations and so forth. Many others are doing other activities. But of this core group, they've managed to produce amazing content. The Well, which is our internal communications engine, has more than double the number of stories this year versus the same period last year, January through August 19, January through August 20. UNC.edu, which is our primary portal and news engine, we are self-publishers at the university, has driven engagement to an all new level. We have doubled that number. We are exceeding 1 million page views now, which means we have a lot of eyes on the stories of this university. Our social channels have added 46,000 followers. So we've taken this moment and we've been able to bring in more people to continue to drive engagement for the university. More importantly, perhaps, we have work that comes to us. So we get inquiries from the news media. Oftentimes those are around the events of the day, but we've been able to take the COVID era and turn that into an opportunity to showcase our faculty researchers, the students, and the way this university has responded. And we've more than doubled the number of media stories placed per month. That team is working really hard. More importantly, perhaps, is the inbound. The media need help from us. They want to find experts. They need answers for their stories. And we're exceeding our expectation, doubling the number of media inquiries processed each month. I share that with you because I want you to know that despite all these events that are happening around us, the teams are continuing to be very proactive in how they place their stories, how we engage with our constituencies online, and looking across the broad enterprise we have here at Carolina, finding important stories and finding new ways and new people to share those with. So I wanted to close with that today and make sure that you knew that this team is working really hard to ensure that those stories are being amplified everywhere. So Chair Davis.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vice Chancellor. Wanted to just thank you and your team for all you're doing in the communications front to tell the many great stories of the way that our faculty, our researchers, our students are making a difference in our state. So thank you for that. Chairman, I'm going to turn that back over to you. That ends my report, and I ran over by 58.7 seconds, for which I apologize.
Before you do that, Chair Davis, there's one other item I'd like your committee and the board to discuss, and that is the Davie Award fall event.
Very good, Chair. Absolutely. So as you know, one of the awards that our Board of Trustees gives annually is the Davie Awards, and we typically bring honorees together for a dinner here at the Carolina Inn to honor them and all that they have contributed to our university. Because of COVID, we will not be having a dinner this year. So I think there are two options that the chair and I have spoken about, and the staff, the TJ, thank you, has been playing out both scenarios to try to determine what might work. One would be to have a Davie Awards dinner over a venue much like the one we have here through the internet, or to move that dinner, just when we have the dinner for 2021, honor the folks from 2020 as well. So without objection, Chair, I would be interested in hearing any comments from my fellow trustees about what they would prefer. And if you don't feel comfortable telling me that at this time, you can reach out to me at the break and let me know. But I open the floor to anyone who has any view at this time.
Gene, what is your recommendation?
Well, Chair Stevens and I really thought it would be best to let the trustees as a whole offer their input. And again, I want to remind each and every one of you, please don't mention any of the names of those honorees. We have not yet released that information. But so, Chair Cochran, do you have a sense of which you would prefer?
I do, and I would defer this year because there's so many things so many variables, and I would put them together next year.
Okay. Thank you, Chair Cochran. Any other thoughts?
Yes,
Trustee Hopkins.
thank you. I would also like to see us celebrate in person when the timing is appropriate.
Very good. Thank you, Trustee Hopkins. Any other thoughts?
Chair Davis, a question just because to make sure I understand this correctly. We are going to let them know and honor them this year, but have them all in person next year. We're not just going to have two groups in 1 year be announced, correct?
Thank you for clarifying that, Chair Duckett. Yes, that's exactly right. We'll let them know this year. They will be the 2020 class, but we will not honor them with a dinner until 2021.
But the media and the release from the university will go on as normal, correct?
That is correct, Chair.
Then I would concur. I think that's a great way to do it. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you. Any other thoughts? Any opposed to waiting until 2021 for a dinner? Seeing no opposition, I think we have a game plan, Chairman. Thank you.
I don't think we need a vote on that. I think by consensus, we concur that we'll announce the fall. And Chancellor, you've already talked to the recipients for this year.
I have, and so I have notified the recipients. They were all felt very honored, and so now I think we will work on a public announcement of that with the notification, the notice that we'll celebrate in person next fall. Okay.
Thank you. I agree. It would be good to be in person to have those honors bestowed, and thank you all for concurring with that. The further business from External Affairs, if not, we'll now go into closed session, and I'll call on Secretary Teresa Artis-Deal for a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move that the board convene in closed session pursuant to North Carolina General Statute, Section 143-318.11, subsection A, subsection 1, to prevent the disclosure of privileged information under Section 126-22, and also pursuant to subsection A, subsection 2, subsection A, subsection 3, subsection A, subsection 5, subsection A, subsection 6, subsection A, subsection 7, subsection A, subsection 9.
Thank you for the motion. Is there a second to the motion?
Second, Gene.
Second.
We have second from Trustee Davis and Cochran. If you would, please call the roll.
Ms. Artis-Neal, yes. Mr. Bolick.
Yes.
Mr. Brown. Mr. Kobe.
Yes.
Mr. Cochran.
Yes.
Mr. Davis.
Yes.
Mr. Duckett.
Yes.
Mrs. Hopkins. Mr. McCullen.
Yes.
Mr. Meekins.
Yes.
Mr. Mosley. Mr. Pryor. Mr. Stevens.
Yes. Motion passes. We will now go into closed session. I want to thank everyone for joining us today. We will be back in open session, and I anticipate there will probably be some actions taken likely in the personnel arena following the closed session. But those of you who are have been with us by Zoom or otherwise, thank you for participating today. We will now take a break, and so we do the mechanics for going into closed session.
Mr. Chairman,
this is David Powers real quick. I'm going to take my leave now that you're going into close, but I do want to commend everybody. Great reports today, and you guys are soldiering on in fine fashion. And I really, really, on behalf of the whole board, want to thank you for the job you're continuing to do. And I also want to add my best wishes to Steve Farmer. I've got to know Steve a little bit over the years and enjoyed working with him, and we'll miss him, but wish him the best of luck.
Thank you, Governor Powers, and thank you for being with us as you've been consistently since you've taken on this job. We appreciate it.
Look forward to being in person soon.
Thank you. Take care.
Thanks.
We will now go into closed session.
All right. Tell me when.
Okay.
We're back in open session. I'd like to recognize Trustee Duckett for a motion from the closed session.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Coming from closed session for the University Affairs Committee, I have 2 action items for EHRA faculty HR actions for both August 2020 and September 2020, and they come forward as a motion for approval.
You heard the motion from Trustee Duckett. Is there a second?
Second.
Second by Trustee Cochran. If you would call the roll.
Ms. Artis Neal, yes. Mr. Bullock.
Yes.
Mr. Kobe.
Yes.
Mr. Cochran.
Yes.
Mr. Duckett.
Yes.
Mrs. Hopkins. Mr. McCullen.
Yes.
Mr. Meekins.
Yes.
Mr. Mosley. Mr. Pryor.
Yes.
Mr. Stevens.
Yes, motion passes. Is there any further business to come before the board today? If not, I'll entertain a motion that we adjourn. Motion by Trustee Pryor.
Second.
Second by Trustee Kobe. Further discussion? If not, all in favor, please answer when the roll is called.
Ms. Artis Neal, yes. Mr. Bullock.
Yes.
Mr. Kobe.
Yes.
Mr. Cochran.
Yes.
Mr. Duckett. Mrs. Hopkins. Mr. McCullen.
Yes.
Mr. Meekins. Mr. Mosley. Mr. Pryor. Mr. Stevens.
Yes, motion passes and we stand adjourned. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.